If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 236, The Ambition to Rebuild the Dragon Pit. After reading the description of the system, Rhaegar's face changed dramatically. Flames hidden deep underground, isn't that magma? He murmured. The volcano on Dragonstone Island was filled with magma. Boom! A small patch of earth mixed with carbon ash suddenly exploded, forming a round pit the size of a face. Rhaegar quickly backed away, thinking the magma was about to erupt. But he was wrong. The Isle of Faces, in the center of God's Eye Lake, was an island. No matter how much underground flame gathered, it couldn't erupt magma here. But something else appeared. Water. A small pool quickly formed at the bottom of the pit. Rhaegar stood guard, unsure of what was happening. The water in the pool bubbled and hissed. Whoosh! A misty mist rose from the puddle, warm and damp. Rhaegar sniffed the air and detected a strong smell of sulfur. He stepped closer and boldly dipped his hand into the water. Hot! Rhaegar murmured, plunging both hands into the water. A word came to him, hot springs. Rumble! The trembling of the Isle of Faces continued, gradually lessening in intensity. The weirwood trees shook and shed their red leaves. Moments later, the trees stood bare, and the small puddle was surrounded by fallen leaves. Rhaegar sat on the ground, gazing at the puddle, red leaves covering his silver hair and shoulders. Is this the earth-breaking fire effect? A small hot spring? Rhaegar mused, resting his chin in his hand. On second thought, hot springs relied on underground heat. The presence of a hot spring indicated a significant change in the island's underground structure. His eyes fell on the system's description again, noting the phrase transforming the land. Rhaegar scooped up some warm spring water and tasted it. The taste of sulfur was strong, pungent and astringent. The taste sparked many thoughts. The dragon lords of Valyria lived amidst the 14 flames, a perfect environment for dragons because of the active volcanoes. The island of Dragonstone also had a volcano where Vermithor and Silverwing slumbered. Volcanic landscapes were rare in West Eros. The only other known place with hot springs was Winterfell, home of the Starks, with a significantly higher underground temperature. Considering this, Rhaegar speculated, at the very least, the geothermal temperature beneath the Isle of Faces is high enough to make it a better place for dragons than the Dragon Pit in King's Landing. This revelation rekindled his old idea to rebuild the Dragon Pit. Staring at the steam-filled spring, Rhaegar felt elated. What a precious piece of land, worthy of a legendary relic. He began to consider claiming the Isle of Faces for himself. Roar! A dragon's roar interrupted his thoughts. Rhaegar looked up to see Rhaenyra riding Syrax, dressed in a black gown. Rhaegar, there's been an earthquake on the Isle of Faces. Come with me, Rhaenyra urged, looking worried as she guided Syrax to land. Roar! Roar! 2 dragon roars echoed through the sky as the sunlight was blocked by massive, charcoal-black dragon wings. Cannibal had taken to the skies and was circling low over the Isle of Faces, clearly fascinated by the island. Helena was riding a panicked Dreamfire, approaching from the direction of the beach on the Isle of Faces. Dragons have sharper senses than humans, and the 3 dragons were immediately alarmed by the island's tremors. Seeing Syrax hesitating to land, Rhaegar shouted, I'm fine, don't worry. He was indeed fine, he had caused the commotion and knew its source. If anything was wrong, it was the few remaining weirwood trees. The hot spring had appeared right next to them, where the underground temperature was highest. He hoped they could withstand the heat. As the aftershocks subsided and calm returned, Syrax and Dreamfire landed first, allowing their riders to dismount. Rhaegar pointed to a small puddle on the ground and grinned. Look, a hot spring. Hey! Rhaenyra looked confused as she stepped over the thick carpet of red leaves. Brother, are you all right? Helena's eyes were filled with concern as she trotted over to Rhaegar. She and Rhaenyra had been up early. Dreamfire had wanted to play, so Helena had accompanied the dragon to the shore of the Isle of Faces. Rhaenyra had been uneasy and had called Syrax to keep watch, still debating whether to wake Rhaegar when the earthquake startled them all. Seeing the concern in Helena's eyes, Rhaegar ruffled her hair and smiled. I'm fine, really. He had explored a legendary tier relic and activated it, resulting in the unexpected bonus of a hot spring. Over time, the geothermal heat on the Isle of Faces would only increase, enhancing the Targaryen family's domain. It really is a hot spring, Rhaenyra remarked, stirring the puddle with her fingers, her surprise evident. She did not dwell on the high underground temperatures. As Princess of Dragonstone, she was accustomed to volcanoes and the conditions necessary to raise dragons. To her, the hot spring merely indicated high underground temperatures, not the extreme environment dragons required. Rhaegar laughed. The hot spring appeared out of nowhere and seems to be expanding. Rhaenyra frowned slightly, still puzzled by the sudden appearance of a hot spring on the Isle of Faces. Unable to figure it out, she decided not to worry. When she felt the warm spring water, her eyes lit up with excitement. If the hot spring gets bigger, we could build a pool exclusively for the royal family. Hot springs were a rare luxury, inaccessible to most. Rhaegar agreed. Yes, I'll provide the labor and you can finance the construction of a great pool. He had thousands of slaves outside King's Landing, perfect for the task. Rhaenyra nodded eagerly. The thought of having an exclusive hot spring bath in the future filled her with happiness. The free trade city-state of Lys. In the dilapidated perfume garden, a group of conspirators were plotting something significant. Tyrosh was represented by a lean young man with fiery hair, playing with a skull-shaped wine glass. His name was Boromir Strode, the current Archon of Tyrosh. As for the former Archon, an elderly man in brocade robes, he now lay dead at Boromir's hands. The only remaining representative from Myr was a fat, dark-skinned man with a whip at his waist. He had been the first to flee when their city was attacked. Myr's forces had been decimated, with only 500 unsullied surviving the assaults of the slaves and the wealthy. In Lys, the Rhaegar family had been destroyed, leading to a slave uprising. In the midst of the chaos, a strong man with curly black hair and dark brown skin, Bombero Bazan, emerged. Once a smuggler, Bombero had saved enough over the years to build a fleet. He seized the opportunity during Lys turmoil to steal power and become the new leader. The fat Myrish man spoke first. News of the dragon's attack on the Triarchy has spread throughout Essos. The Sea King of Bravos has only agreed to send a letter condemning the king on the Iron Throne and has refused to send troops. It's the same everywhere, Boromir scoffed. Other city-states have retreated as well, only daring to send letters of condemnation. Boromir had risen from the ranks of mercenaries. His rise to Archon was due to his daring during the dragon attack. He had plundered the wealthiest merchants and hired more mercenaries. His audacity had paid off. Bombero of Lys took a small bottle from his pocket and said in a deep voice, "The mastermind of the attack has returned to Westeros. We must take action to show the people that we are doing something. They weren't the last desperate fools gambling their lives. They needed to set an example for the high-ranking magisters and rich merchants who felt persecuted, demonstrating their resolve." The small vial contained Lys tears, a poison that could take a life without the victim knowing. "Who should we target?" asked the Myrish representative. "There are 2 other dragon riders on the Stepstone Islands," Boromir suggested. "I agree." A few days later. The northern shore of the God's Eye. Swish swish. 400 unsullied and 500 second sons marched in, forming neat rows. "Greetings, Prince!" 1,000 voices cried in unison. In front of them stood a massive black dragon, as imposing as a small mountain. "Roar!" Cannibal roared, its feet firmly planted on the ground, wings spread wide, generating powerful gusts of wind. Rhaegar stood beneath its head, glancing sideways at the assembled army. His expression remained calm, indifferent to the 1,000-strong force before him. He turned his gaze towards Harrenhal in the distance. The green wildfire had finally been extinguished. After the fire, Harrenhal, already in ruins and decrepit, looked even more desolate, like a dying candle. The 5 towers were charred black by the flames. The forest of sacred trees was reduced to ashes, and even the nearby city walls were cracked and burned. Smoke rose from the ruins, making the twisted towers appear even darker. Lionel was seriously ill and Harwin was on patrol. Rhaenyra had taken on the role of first steward, directing the servants to clean up the towers and move supplies. "Robb," Rhaegar called. Robb, clad in a heavy steel helmet, stepped forward immediately and saluted, "Prince." Rhaegar glanced at him and ordered, "Lead the second sons to Riverrun. If you meet the Blackwoods army on the way, you know what to do." Robb, already prepared, replied firmly, "I guarantee a safe arrival." Rhaegar nodded and motioned for him to rest before leaving. Robb led his party to a barracks the Stronghouse had set up in advance. Rhaegar's eyes flickered as his mind wandered. He should have left for Riverrun days ago. For some reason, he was waiting for Robb and the Second Sons to arrive. Most of the soldiers of the Second Sons came from the Riverlands, often the second sons or illegitimate children of noble families. Robb himself was a favored bastard of Lord Blackwood. This organization wasn't just powerful in arms, it was a valuable political asset. The Stronghouse's army passing through the Blackwoods garrison and the second sons doing the same were two different things. Dragons were effective in battle, but Lionel's advice to win hearts and minds by using internal factions was sound. Robb and the second sons were instrumental in quelling the rebellion in the Riverlands. As Rhaegar reflected on this, a phrase from his dreams came to mind. War is the continuation of politics. Wars were caused by political failures. His thoughts returned to the Unsullied and his gaze fell upon them. Rhaegar looked at an Unsullied commander with 3 spikes on his helmet and asked, "What is your name?" The officer stiffened and blurted out, "Grey Worm." "Grey Worm," Rhaegar repeated, confused. "That's the name the slave masters of Astapor gave you, isn't it?" He knew something of the Unsullied. Every day, names were drawn from slips of paper with colors and different types of reptiles on them. Together they formed the name of the day. Chapter 237, The Dragon Has 3 Heads. "Yes, Prince," Grey Worm replied, looking straight ahead. "Why don't you all change your names so you're no longer tied to slavery?" Rhaegar asked, intrigued. The Unsullied had been trafficked as children, and by the age of 4 or 5 they should remember their original names. Grey Worm replied solemnly, "The name that once brought me pain and enslaved me is no longer a burden. The day Astapor fell, I sought your protection," he continued, his chest swelling with pride. "Since that day, I have kept the name Grey Worm. It now symbolizes my sanity and my courage to fight for freedom." Swoosh! As he spoke, the Unsullied struck their round shields with their spears in unison, their eyes filled with admiration as they gazed upon Rhaegar and the dragon. Rhaegar's expression softened as he surveyed the more than 400 Unsullied, his gaze calm and collected. From this diverse group of warriors, he sensed a pure essence. It was called faith. They longed for freedom and peace, and they saw Rhaegar as their beacon. The old and new gods would not save these castrated slave soldiers. But Rhaegar, who had burned the city with his dragon, would. Rhaegar Targaryen, breaker of shackles, ruin maker, that was what they believed. Rhaegar withdrew his scrutinizing gaze and smiled, "A perfectly trustworthy army." "Grey Worm," he called. "Yes, Prince." Grey Worm stepped forward, his voice firm. Rhaegar resumed his authoritative tone, "We don't need too many troops to put down the rebellion. Harrenhal has suffered greatly from the fire. Lead the army to station here and prevent any counterattacks." "Yes, Prince." Grey Worm accepted the mission and immediately led the troops to join the patrol. Rhaegar raised his head to the sky and murmured, "Riverrun City, Blackwood." Dusk. 3 dragons rose from Harrenhal and soared toward Riverrun. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a reddish haze over the flat, fertile land. Rivers flowed endlessly, and farmlands stretched as far as the eye could see. This was the Riverlands, the land of fish and grain. In the heart of the noble path, the farmland had been pillaged and burned, mostly by marauding bands of outlaws. Roar! As they neared Riverrun, Cannibal slowed and roared a warning. Rhaegar looked down and saw a large, well-fortified camp on a high hill not far from Riverrun. Watchtowers, archery posts, horses and other defences were in place. At the foot of the hill, a meandering stream provided a natural barrier. Rhaegar took one look and knew the general in charge was strategically astute. The hilltop camp was easy to defend and difficult to attack. With sufficient supplies, it could withstand a prolonged siege. It would be a tough nut to crack. Above the camp's gatehouse flew a noble banner depicting crows surrounding a weirwood tree. Rhaegar recognized it, House Blackwood. His respect for the Blackwoods grew. The camp's location was strategically brilliant. House Blackwood's Raventree Hall lay west of the Red Fork River, south of Harrenhal. Running Stream was at the confluence of the Red Fork and Tumblestone rivers. House Bracken's Stone Hedge was north of the Red Fork and northeast of Riverrun. The Blackwood-Bracken conflict raged on the north bank of the Red Fork, in fertile pasture land. Recently, Harwin's army from Riverrun had clashed with the vanguards of both houses. House Bracken, recovering from defeat, had launched a night attack on Harwin's camp. Harwin and the Tullis had retreated to Harrenhal. Now the Blackwoods had set up camp south of Riverrun and west of Stone Hedge, effectively blocking the route between Riverrun, Stone Hedge, and Harrenhal. They didn't attack, but they were a thorn in the side, destabilizing the Riverlands. Their tactics were notorious, but undeniably effective. As the campfires began to cook dinner, Cannibal swooped down and wreaked havoc. Dragon! The dragon is coming! Hide in the burrows! The presence of the black dragon caused instant panic. Soldiers abandoned their posts and dove into the holes they had dug for cover. Roar! Before the soldiers could fully retreat, Dreamfire and Syrinx swooped down, their wings whipping up fierce whines. Crash! At Helena's command, Dreamfire flicked his tail and snapped the camp's flagpole. In an instant, the three dragons rose again. Syrinx flew close to Cannibal, and Rhaenyra, clad in her black dragon armor, shouted, "Rhaegar, is this all we're doing?" She had been expecting an attack as the dragons swooped down. Rhaegar looked at the chaos below and chuckled, "No need for violence today." The three dragons flew over the barracks, confident that the Blackwoods would make the right choice. Roar! Cannibal roared, lifting his wings in the turbulent river toward the city of Riverrun. Dreamfire and Syrinx circled around, close behind. Riverrun. A sturdy, triangular castle built where the Tumblestone River meets the Red Fork. The castle is relatively small, bordered on two sides by the river, with a large man-made moat on the west side. When the water gate is opened, the trench fills with river water, transforming the castle into a small island surrounded by water on three sides and nearly impregnable. At that moment, Riverrun's water gate was open. Water flowed around the castle and the drawbridge was raised. Roar! The dragon's roar echoed as Cannibal flapped its wings and slowly descended in front of the water-filled trench. Rhaegar, seated on his saddle, looked down at the garrison on Riverrun's battlements and shouted, "The Prince and Princess of Targaryen have arrived. Summon the sons of Lord Tully to welcome us." Roar! Syrinx and Dreamfire followed, landing one on either side of Cannibal. The three dragons raised their heads, staring at the triangular castle. The garrison, having never witnessed such a sight, nearly lost their composure. In a panic, they hurried down the battlements to notify the two gentlemen in charge. Rhaegar watched calmly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The Tully family, as the lords of the Riverlands, held a crucial position. To pacify the rebellion, Riverrun had to be visited first. Nightfall. On Bloodstone Island, patrol ships continued their nightly rounds, diligently scanning the waters. They intercepted a small sailboat attempting to smuggle goods. There were 3 men aboard, all from the Stormlands of West Eros. Upon capture, Thessaldiers discovered the boat's cargo, leather barley and dozens of bottles of red wine from Lys. One of the smugglers, trembling with fear, knelt and begged, "My lord, please, we are only trying to make a living. Save your breath, smuggler." A soldier kicked him to the ground, spitting in contempt. Smugglers were despised, even lower than poachers in West Eros. "Let's see what we have here," a middle-aged voice commanded. 2 silver-haired, dark-skinned figures emerged from the patrol ship, Commander Viamond and his nephew, Laenor. Viamond examined the cargo with a practiced eye. When his eyes fell on the red wine, his expression changed. The prolonged war had left ample supplies, but good wine was in short supply. The quality red wine was a rare treat. "Take the wine and throw these men into the sea," Viamond ordered, his voice cold and dismissive. The Valyrians, with their maritime heritage, knew well the ruthless law of the sea. The smuggler pleaded desperately, "My lord, I have a pregnant wife to care for. Please, show mercy. The old and new gods will bless you." Viamond remained unmoved. "Do as I said. Feed them to the fish." "Yes, my lord," the soldiers replied, dragging the men to the edge of the ship. Panicked, the smuggler shouted, "Wait! I have 2 bottles of Dornish Summer Red, 10 years old, the finest wine you'll ever taste." "Wait," Viamond commanded, intrigued. "Aged Summer Red?" The smuggler nodded frantically. "Yes, my lord. It's on the ship. A gift for you." "Fetch it," Viamond ordered, his interest piqued. The smuggler rushed to the ship and returned with a wooden case containing 2 bottles of wine, the liquid inside as crimson as blood. With shaking hands, he offered the bottles. Viamond opened one and took a deep breath, savoring the fruity aroma. "True Summer Red," he confirmed with satisfaction. He passed the other bottle to Laenor. "Enjoy, nephew. It's been a while since we've had good wine." "Thank you, uncle," Laenor said, pleased. It had been a long time since he had tasted good wine. Viamond smiled, pleased. "Take the wine. Dispose of the rest." The soldiers quickly executed the smugglers and plundered the remaining goods. Before they left, they set fire to the sailboat. With the precious bottle of wine, Laenor returned to Bloodstone Island, eager to share his find with Aegon. He found his cousin secluded in his tent. "Cousin, look what I've got," Laenor announced, lifting the tent flap. "No, no. Don't come in yet," Aegon cried, his voice strained. He lay naked, his hands hidden under the blanket. "Oh, by the 7 gods!" Laenor exclaimed, turning away in embarrassment. "Sorry, I didn't know you were busy." "Just a moment," Aegon grunted, his movements quickening. His body tensed and he let out a low moan. "Are you finished?" Laenor asked, half amused, half annoyed. Chapter 238, Aegon's Little Buddy. The next day at dawn. In the great hall of Riverrun, old Tully's 2 sons and a retinue of retainers lined both sides of the room. Above them, in a separate chamber, Rhaegar, clad in black, sat on the lord's high seat. A bell chimed softly as Helaena, standing by Rhaegar's side, rang it to summon the servants. Rhaenyra quickly took the bell from her and gave her a stern look. Helaena shrank back, snuggling into Rhaegar's lap, silenced. Bang! The hall doors burst open and Robb Rivers strode in, helmeted and tired after a grueling day and night journey to Riverrun. Rhaegar, his hands on the armrests, tilted his head. "My love, step forward." My love Tully, the second son of old Tully, stepped forward, his head hanging low with trepidation. His lewd, gaunt appearance spoke of a life of debauchery. Rhaegar eyed him with disdain. "Riverrun has 1,000 defenders. Why did you avoid fighting?" The old Lord Tully's sons had been left to stew for a day and a night. It was time to see what they were made of. My love, barely lifting his head, replied weakly, "Prince, my father ordered us to defend the city, not send troops." Rhaegar snorted and summoned old Tully's youngest son. This man, fat as a pig with a mop of red hair, resembled a reborn boar. Before Rhaegar could speak, the young man blurted out, "I wanted to send troops, but no one would obey my orders." His face, trembling with random jerks, showed a lack of intelligence that explained his failure to command. "Enough, both of you, get out!" Rhaegar bellowed, not wasting another look. The Tully brothers, relieved as if pardoned, slipped out the side door. Riverrun was the stronghold of the Tully house, and this meeting was crucial to the safety of the Riverlands. Yet the brothers showed no concern, only an eagerness to avoid responsibility. Rhaegar sighed, momentarily sympathizing with old Tully's plight. At that moment, a young man with black hair stepped forward and asked, "Prince, I hear the chaotic army is besieging Harrenhal. Are Lord Lionel and my grandfather safe?" Rhaegar recognized the young man. It was Elmo Tully, the 16-year-old grandson of old Tully and the only son of the heir who had died in the rebellion. "Lord Lionel is recovering and Lord Tully is well," Rhaegar replied. Elmo, relieved, inquired further, "Prince, with both lords well, do you have a strategy for dealing with the Blackwoods and the Brackens?" His temperament mirrored that of his grandfather and late father, not possessing great skills, but brimming with cleverness. Rhaegar surveyed the hall, noting the absence of significant bannermen and a lack of leadership. In response to Elmo's question, he declared, "The Blackwood and Bracken House have risen in rebellion and will face severe consequences." The room erupted in murmurs. Elmo's eyes lit up with anticipation. With his father dead and his uncles being useless, Elmo stood to inherit Riverrun when his grandfather died. If he could use the royal family to subjugate the Blackwoods and Brackens or take territory from them, his future as lord would be much more secure. "Robb," Rhaegar called, gesturing to his loyal supporter. Robb stepped forward, his head held high. Rhaegar continued, "At Lord Lionel's suggestion, we will negotiate with the 2 houses first. As Lord Blackwood's son and heir, you will lead the way." Rhaegar's choice of words, "lead the way," was deliberate. His gaze shifted to Elmo, scrutinizing him. "Your uncles have proved not being capable enough. As the ducal family of the Riverlands, Riverrun should send a representative." Elmo hesitated, taken aback. Despite his knightly training, he had never seen the battlefield, living a sheltered life under the protection of his grandfather and father. Now he was being asked to represent his family against the rebels. The pressure was immense. Rhaegar tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "What, you don't dare?" Compared to House Bracken laying siege to Harrenhal, House Blackwood is much easier to deal with. With Robb leading the way, the pressure is off Elmo. If he backs down, 3 generations of the Tully family will be ruined. Elmo gathered his courage, the prince's taunt spurring him on. "I will represent my house and convince the Blackwoods to surrender," he declared loudly. Stepping forward in this capacity effectively positioned Elmo as the family's heir. He had to rise to the occasion. "Very well," Rhaegar said, sitting up straighter. "You will be the messengers to invite Lord Blackwood to Riverrun for negotiations." Elmo was taken aback. "Lord Blackwood's army is stationed outside the city. Why would he come to us?" "That is not your concern," Rhaegar replied firmly. "Invite him here under the guise of a visit to the Targaryens." The Blackwoods had been slow to attack, probably hoping to take advantage of the situation. The show of force by the three dragons was both a warning and a gesture of goodwill. With Rhaegar's orders, Robb and Elmo had no choice but to comply. "By the prince's command, we leave now," Robb said crisply and turned to leave. Elmo hesitated, but followed. Once they were gone, Rhaegar turned to the maester. "Write a letter inviting Lord Bracken to Riverrun and send it with a raven to Stonehenge." The maester bowed and withdrew. Rhaegar's plan was clear: show courtesy before resorting to force. If the two lords came to Riverrun, they would be captured and sent to King's Landing for judgment. If they refused, 3 dragons were ready to make their presence felt over Riverrun. A day later, at the Blackwood House camp. Inside a large tent, Robb and Elmo were let in, bound and gagged. Waiting for them was a stern, middle-aged man with black hair, Lord Blackwood, and his eldest son, Samwell Blackwood. When Lord Blackwood saw Robb, he frowned and ordered, "Untie him." The ropes were removed and Robb immediately addressed his captors, "Lord Blackwood, we are emissaries from Prince Rhaegar. He invites you to Riverrun to meet and negotiate." Despite his predicament, Robb refrained from calling Blackwood father to avoid further complicating matters. "Breathe and speak slowly, brother," Samwell urged, helping Robb to his feet. Robb nodded. "The prince wants to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and persuade the Blackwoods to surrender." "Oh, he thinks he's invincible because he has dragons." Lord Blackwood scoffed. Robb paused, then raised his head defiantly. "You can refuse, but if Dragonfire rains down, I may end up inheriting your lands and your castle." "How dare you? Who gave you the courage to speak to me like that?" Lord Blackwood shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Robb. Even if the family line were to die out, a bastard would never inherit. Lord Blackwood realized that Robb's provocation was deliberate, meant to force him to consider the consequences. Calming himself, Lord Blackwood asked, "What does the prince intend to do with our family?" "I don't know," Robb answered honestly. Samwell looked confused. "Brother Robb, you're the prince's closest advisor. Hasn't he given any indication?" Robb shook his head and said, "The Blackwoods have not caused as much trouble as the Brackens." Samwell looked at his father, who was deep in thought. The implications were clear: the Brackens were the primary culprits. Half an hour later, Lord Blackwood rubbed his temples and sighed, "I'm going to Riverrun to meet the prince." "Samwell, you will stay here and lead the army." "Yes, father," Samwell replied, concern evident in his voice. At the same time, in Stoneleigh City, the maester received a raven's message and promptly delivered it to the Lord of Bracken, Amos Bracken. Amos, a square-faced young man with brown curly hair, read the message carefully. When he reached the end, his face contorted with rage. Tearing the letter to shreds, he cursed, "Damn them! Do they think they can trick me into entering Riverrun City? Do they take me for a fool?" The maester, standing nearby, cautioned, "Lord Amos, scouts report there are 3 dragons in Riverrun. It might be wise to meet with them." Amos glared at him, "Nonsense! If I go there, I'll be walking into a trap." The maester sighed, bowing his head. Amos, still agitated, snapped, "Go and tell that fool to prepare more wildfire, and bring the priestess here. I need her counsel." "Lord Amos, True was a maester once. You should show some respect," the maester replied in displeasure. Amos dismissed him with a wave, "Stop arguing and do as I say." The maester, feeling disrespected, had no choice but to leave with a sullen expression. Not long after, a voluptuous woman in red robes, a priestess from a foreign land, arrived. 2 days earlier. Bloodstone Island. Aegon rose from his bed, his hair disheveled and spread out around him. He had spent the night indulging in various pleasures. Laenor, standing nearby, looked at him with a playful smile and held up a bottle of wine. "I found a bottle of summer red. Let's share it," Laenor suggested. Aegon, irritated and dismissive, threw on some clothes. Keep your distance. I'm not interested in a man's appetite, he snapped. Laenor's preferences were known, but Aegon had not yet explored such inclinations. He was particular about his partners, and men were not among his choices. Laenor's voice remained soft. Relax, Aegon. You're my cousin. I'd never touch you unless you wanted me to. Aegon, clearly still in a bad mood, grabbed the bottle from Laenor. What good wine can there be on this island? It's not worth washing my cock with, he said roughly. He bit off the cork and, to Laenor's horror, poured the wine over himself to clean up. No! Laenor exclaimed, clearly distraught. This is Dorne's Summer Red, aged 10 years. It was too late. The bottle was already empty, and Aegon threw it to the ground, shattering it. He looked at Laenor with dark, empty eyes. Summer Red? 10 years old. He repeated, mocking the meaning. Laenor's face was a mixture of helplessness and frustration. Yes, a bottle worth 100 gold dragons. Aegon's face twisted in a mixture of realization and indifference. 100 gold dragons? You should have told me sooner. My cock isn't worth that much. Gritting his teeth, Laenor replied bitterly, then perhaps you should have chopped it off. Chapter 239, The Most Vicious Insult. Riverrun. The rhythmic beat of drums echoed through the hall of Riverrun as Lord Blackwood entered with a solemn stride. Above the hall, in a large chamber, Rhaegar lounged in a high seat, one leg crossed and his hand resting on his face. Ah, he sighed contentedly as Rhaenyra peeled a grape and offered it to him. He accepted the grape with a look of mild surprise and chewed thoughtfully. Rhaenyra, unusually attentive today, rolled her eyes before returning to her seat. Click, clack, came the sound of stones hitting each other. Helaena sat on her knees in front of a table, engrossed in a game with 2 stones. Below, Lord Blackwood watched the scene, the 3 Targaryen heirs in their various states of distraction. Feeling the weight of the moment, he bowed deeply. The Blackwood house greets you, Your Grace. Rhaegar smiled slightly and peeled a grape for himself, the hall otherwise silent except for the occasional murmur of Helaena. Lord Blackwood sensed a rising tension and surveyed Robb and Elmo, noting that the atmosphere was far from ideal. The intimidation was palpable. After a moment's contemplation, he adjusted his approach. Princess, it has been a long time. May the old gods praise your beauty. He bowed respectfully and looked up at the table. Rhaenyra looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. She shifted slightly, her embarrassment evident as she tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. The Blackwoods had been her staunchest supporters, though their relationship had grown distant since 111 AC. Still, the Blackwood house continued to send annual greetings and gifts, a gesture to maintain their ties. Noticing Rhaegar still watching her, Rhaenyra sighed and replied formally, May the old gods forgive your sins, Lord Kellen Blackwood. Lord Blackwood, whose full name was Kellen Blackwood, felt a slight relief at her response. He then said, Princess, the emissary from Riverrun has invited me here for negotiations. How may I be of service? Eager to put the conversation on a more stable footing, he tried to discern the intentions behind the summons. Rhaenyra remained silent, deferring to Rhaegar, who began tapping his fingers on the tabletop. Finally, Rhaegar spoke, Lord Blackwood, your house has fought a private war with the Bracken House, refused royal mediation, defied the orders of your liege, Grover Tully, and even clashed with the forces of Riverrun. Each point was punctuated by a tap of his fingers, the sound echoing like a drumbeat in the hall. Rhaegar's hand stilled, his voice turning icy. Lord Blackwood, can I understand that you and your house are in rebellion? Silence fell over the hall, heavy and foreboding. Lord Blackwood stood in that brief, tense silence, grappling with the gravity of the accusation. Kellen's heart skipped a beat as he regretted coming to the trial. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a condemnation. Swallowing hard, Kellen spoke in a deep voice, No. House Blackwood is loyal to Targaryen rule and has no second thoughts. Under such pressure, he had no choice but to bow his head, and his words were sincere. Before entering Riverrun, he had seen the 3 dragons with his own eyes, especially the black, colossal cannibal, towering like a small fortress. Such extraordinary creatures were beyond human resistance. Rhaegar's voice rose, but you disobeyed the king's order, attacked your feudal lord, and stationed troops outside of Riverrun without authorization. With a thud, Kellen fell to his knees and bowed his head. Prince, those orders came from me alone. I alone bear the responsibility. When he came to Riverrun, he did not expect to leave unscathed. After insulting both the royal family and the Tullus, he knew there would be a price to pay. Rhaegar looked down at him with an indifferent expression. The quick confession was noted. Rhaegar, we need the Blackwood army to confront House Bracken, Rhaenyra whispered in his ear, offering a letter in her hand. Rhaegar's cold demeanor softened as he read the letter from the Bracken family, detailing their refusal to admit guilt and their defiance. This was a house that called for stern measures. Following Rhaenyra's advice, Rhaegar rose, walked to the edge of the room, and announced, Lord Kellen, you will return to King's Landing alone to confess your sins. Your eldest son will inherit your title and lead the army to atone for these transgressions. He preferred not to deal harshly with nobles who confessed willingly. The final judgment was left to his father and the small council. Samwell Blackwood, Kellen's eldest son, had already pledged loyalty and could serve as a sharp sword for their cause. Kellen slowly closed his eyes and accepted his fate. Yes, Prince. He had anticipated this outcome and the loss of his position, but it was a small price to save his house. Moreover, their longtime rivals, the Bracken house, were on the brink of destruction. With trembling legs, Kellen rose and walked out of the hall, his back heavy with resignation. Robb, feeling a pang of sympathy, lowered his head, remembering the prince's words on the journey here: House Blackwood must surrender quickly or face dire consequences. Robb! Rhaegar called out, catching his attention. Robb lifted his head and responded, Prince, what is your command? Take the men of the Second Sons and mobilize Commander Samwell's army. March to Stonehenge immediately. Rhaegar's mind was clear and his plan was already in motion. Yes, Prince. Robb bowed and left to carry out his orders. Rhaegar then turned to Elmo. Gather 1,000 soldiers and block their retreat along the Red Fork River. Elmo, not daring to refuse, left quickly. He had just returned to Riverrun and now had to leave again without rest. The exhaustion was obvious, but Rhaegar did not care. Everyone had to work for the sake of their families. Rhaegar, shouldn't we return to Harrenhal first and discuss our strategy with Lord Leonor? Rhaenyra stepped forward, her voice low. The Blackwoods had 2,000 men, while Riverrun could barely muster 1,000. If both sides set out at the same time, it would take about a day and a night to reach Stonehenge. No need. We will rest in Riverrun tonight, Rhaegar replied firmly. He turned and smiled. Lord Leonor's allegiance is to a benevolent king, and his actions will reflect that benevolence. I have my own ideas. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room. Helena stood stunned, the stones she had been playing with shattering in her hands. Broken, she murmured in confusion. Rhaegar glanced over, curious. He took her hand gently, ruffling her lightly curled silver hair. Helena looked up, confused, and let him ruffle her hair with his large hands. Never mind, I'll ignore both of you. Rhaenyra said, unable to bear the sight of the siblings' closeness. She gave Rhaegar a look before leaving. Rhaegar smiled, ignoring the meaning of her glare. When you are a young man, it is important that you keep to yourself. A day and a night had passed. Blackwood's army had maneuvered into position. They were now camped 5 miles south of Stonehenge, a castle located south of the Red Fork River, near the Inn of the Kneeling Man, High Heart and Acorn Hall, and east of Riverrun. The castle itself was built on a hillside, with a ridge running along its south side, creating a natural barrier. Meanwhile, Riverrun's army had reached the banks of the Red Fork River first, effectively blocking Stonehenge's retreat to the north. Despite the looming threat, Stonehenge remained eerily silent, its gates tightly shut, the atmosphere tense and foreboding. Roar! Rhaegar arrived astride Cannibal, the dragon's wings flapping mightily as it descended. The wind whipped his black robe around him. He had grown fond of this attire after his campaigns in the Triarchy Kingdom. The loose black robe was fast, durable, and sturdy, perfect for battle. Anticipating a fierce clash, he had donned it in advance. Boom! Cannibal landed on the muddy ground, spraying dirt in all directions. As Rhaegar dismounted, Samwell rushed over. Prince, Samwell said respectfully, Amos Bracken is trapped in the Stonehenge and cannot avoid battle. Shall we prepare for a direct attack? Rhaegar laughed derisively. Amos talks tough in his letters and claims he will defend the castle to the death. The letter from Amos had been half a plea about the kingdom's injustices and half a tirade against the Blackwood house, refusing to admit any fault and eager for immediate war. Robb approached, his expression grave. Prince, Lord Amos has forced many civilians into Stonehenge, probably hoping to use them as human shields to deter you. A despicable tactic, Rhaegar spat, then said firmly, send a message to Amos. Tell him to meet me at the city gates for a talk. Whether the conversation was successful or not, the effort had to be made. If Dragonfire ended up destroying the city, public opinion would favor Rhaegar's attempt at diplomacy. Yes, Prince, Robb replied, sending a bastard son of a knightly family loyal to the Brackens to deliver the message. After a tense wait, the messenger returned with news. Amos had agreed to meet, but with two conditions. They were to speak only under the battlements at the city gates, and Rhaegar was to bring only one dragon, allowing Amos to escape quickly if necessary. Roar! Rhaegar glanced up at Syrinx and Dreamfire circling above, their vertical pupils fixed on Stonehenge. No problem. I'll meet him, Rhaegar said with a confident smile. He called for Robb and some guards to accompany him. Arriving at the gate of Stonehenge, Rhaegar and his retinue were met by a grim-faced Amos Bracken standing beneath the gate stacks, surrounded by a large group of soldiers. Rhaegar approached slowly, a smile playing on his lips as he approached the drawbridge. Cannibal eyes glinted from the shadows, its green pupils glowing with a menacing light. Robb followed close behind, sword in hand, proclaiming loudly, "Behold Rhaegar Targaryen, eldest son of Viserys, breaker of shackles, maker of ruins, and the heir to the Iron Throne." Amos hesitated for a moment, processing the string of titles. Rhaegar, accustomed to such introductions, remained calm. In addition to his identity, the titles of Breaker of Shackles and Maker of Ruins were earned after the burning of the Triarchy, reflecting both awe and fear. With both parties now only 5 meters apart, Rhaegar's expression hardened. "Amos, release the civilians in the city and you will be left with a whole body." Amos gripped the hilt of his sword, his voice defiant. "Prince, if you withdraw now, the Lord of Light will forgive your sins." Rhaegar raised an eyebrow. Has the Bracken House changed its beliefs? Some lords in the Riverlands believed in both the old and new gods, including houses like Blackwood, Bracken, and Tully. Amos raised his chin arrogantly. "I have the protection of the Lord of Light. The gods have given me strength." He drew his long sword and pointed it at Cannibal with reckless bravado. "Targaryens are of fire, and the Lord of Light has given me fire. From wildfire." Rhaegar frowned, wondering if Amos was as foolish as he seemed. "Wrong!" Amos roared, seemingly emboldened. "Wildfire is but a product of alchemy. I have the aid of the Lord of Light." "Foolishness!" Rhaegar decided, losing interest in further dialogue. "Release the civilians, or Stonehenge will be reduced to rubble. They are my people, they will live and die with me." Amos declared with a mad look. "The Targaryens are full of sin, you are also an abomination created by sin." Rhaegar's face darkened, fury burning in his eyes. Even Robb stiffened, inwardly raging at Amos's audacity. Seeing Rhaegar's anger, Amos laughed wildly. "You are full of sin and filth. The king will assign you to follow the tradition and accept that even more abominable creatures are born." Roar! Cannibal roared, stretching its thick neck, its gaze locked onto Amos. The dragon's green pupils glowed ferociously, sensing its master's wrath. The humiliation cut deep. The Targaryen tradition, a point of contention for centuries, was rarely mocked so openly since the reigns of Rhaegar the Cruel and Jaehaerys I. Rhaegar's purple eyes turned scarlet, flames dancing within. One thought consumed him. His voice was hoarse but resolute, "Dracarys." Chapter 240, When the sun sets, your bloodline will be over. Boom! A pillar of ghostly green dragon fire descended, crossing the narrow suspension bridge and crashing into the stone city gate. "No! Get out of the way!" Amos Bracken, shocked by the approaching flames, shoved the guards aside and threw himself at the open gate. Zira! The relentless dragon fire slowly melted the stone gate. As the flames roared, Rhaegar, clad in black robes, stepped forward, his face cold and unyielding. Behind him, Robb and the guards fell to the ground, shielding their heads from the searing heat. Roar! The dragon fire ceased, and Cannibal let out a low, menacing growl, flapping its pitch-black wings. Rhaegar approached the city gates. The dragon fire had incinerated a group of soldiers, leaving only charred remains. The stone gatehouse above crumbled, its surface twisted and molten. Bang! Rhaegar kicked open a burning wooden gate and found Amos Bracken trembling at the foot of the wall. "Come out, Lord Amos!" Rhaegar's voice was icy as he grabbed Amos by the collar and lifted him up. "Let me go, I am a follower of the Lord of Light." Amos's feet dangled from the ground, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against Rhaegar's grip. It doesn't matter who you follow. I have no intention of killing you now. With the rebel leader in his grasp, Rhaegar's anger simmered, replaced by cold determination. Release Lord Amos. The soldiers defending the city rushed down the stairs, forming a hesitant semicircle around Rhaegar. None dared approach, wary of the black dragon glaring at them. Ignoring the soldiers, Rhaegar spoke softly, Amos, you have insulted me and you will not die easily. He threw Amos to the ground in disgust. Swoosh! Rhaegar drew his sword and pointed it at the cowering Amos. He looked at him with contempt, as if he were already dead. Before Amos and the assembled soldiers, Rhaegar made a chilling proclamation. When the sun sets, your bloodline will be over. His words were like shards of ice piercing the silence. A gust of wind ruffled Rhaegar's long silver and gold hair. Amos and his soldiers fell silent, all eyes fixed on the young heir, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. Rhaegar's eyes were cold and detached, ignoring the fear, anger, and pleas around him. He turned and walked calmly out of the stone hedge, his black-robed figure radiating resolute authority. No one dared follow or speak. The weight of his words hung in the air. On the suspension bridge, Robb stood and asked with suppressed anger, Prince, shall we attack immediately? Let us wait, Rhaegar replied, his voice calm. Let Stonehenge have the last sunset. Robb was confused. Sunset? He looked at the guards, who shared his confusion. They hadn't heard Rhaegar's explanation, but his determination was unmistakable. The sun was still rising, nearing its zenith around 10 a.m. Moments later, Rhaegar returned to the army encampment. As he dismounted, he was surrounded by Samwell and other officers. Prince, does the Bracken House intend to resist to the end? When will we attack the city? The questions buzzed around him like flies. Rhaegar's gaze remained fixed on a distant hill. He ordered, reinforce the patrol. Don't let a single man escape. The officers, sensing an imminent battle, were elated. Only one noticed something different about Rhaegar. Rhaenyra stepped onto the muddy grass and grabbed Rhaegar's shoulders. Rhaegar, do you have something to tell me? Their eyes met, reflecting each other's determination. After a moment's silence, Rhaegar blinked and smiled. He wrapped his arms around Rhaenyra's waist and buried his head in her hair. Nothing, just a trivial matter. I can handle it for you, Rhaenyra whispered, holding him close. Don't worry, it's just a dirty task, Rhaegar replied, lifting his head and pointing to the distant hill. The evening sun will add much color tonight. Patting her slender waist, he released her and strode toward the hillside. In Rhaenyra's uncomprehending eyes, he added, take care of Helena. We don't need Syrinx and Dreamfire this time. He alone would ride the dragon, bringing the Bracken House the dragon fire they deserved. Stonehenge, Great Hall. Amos burst through the door like a mad dog, yelling, A maester, fetch me the maester. A servant, head bowed, whispered, My lord, the maester has disappeared. Bastard, no sign of him at this hour. Amos' hair was disheveled, his eyes darted nervously around the hall. Call the Red Witch and that stupid pig. Yes, my lord. The servant, sensing his master's unstable mental state, quickly retreated. Amos breathed heavily, cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The fear of Rhaegar's words gnawed at him. He had to act or face dire consequences. He pulled a token from his pocket and clutched it tightly. Made of iron and engraved with a fiery red heart, it felt warm and heavy in his hand. The Lord of Light will bless me. Murmuring a prayer, Amos dashed out of the hall through a side door. The castle was eerily quiet. Servants hid in their rooms, a stark contrast to the usual bustle. Ignoring the silence, Amos ran to the forest of sacred trees in the center of the castle. The small forest, a few acres in size, was filled with pine and birch trees. In its center lay the stump of a felled weirwood tree, its bright red leaves scattered like blood on the ground. Amos' face twisted with conflicting emotions as he stared at the stump. The Bracken House had long worshipped the old gods, but the arrival of the Red Witch had changed everything. Her miracles in the name of the Lord of Light had overshadowed the glory of the old gods. Against the advice of his bannerman, Amos had cut down the sacred weirwood, abandoning the old gods for the Lord of Light. Treading on the red leaves, Amos steeled himself. Soon, the forest echoed with the sound of footsteps. Hundreds of soldiers halted at the edge, guarding their lord. Two distinct figures stood in the forefront. One was a towering, bear-like man in grey robes. The other, a striking red-haired sorceress, wore a beautiful red robe. Lord Bracken, the Red Witch spoke, her voice a sultry whisper. Her white, lithe thighs peeked out from under her red robe as she moved, her tone inviting and seductive. The grey-robed fat man shivered and covered his ears, unable to bear the sound. His name was True, expelled from the citadel for an accidental wildfire outbreak during his experiments. Amos' face was grim. Struggling to maintain his composure, he asked, Red Witch, can the Lord of Light you spoke of really make my army impervious to dragon fire? The Red Witch, shaken by his grip on her shoulders, gently placed a finger on his lips. Amos stepped back, confused. Do not worry. The Lord of Light is the one true God. You must believe in his greatness, she said confidently. Bending down, she picked up a fallen leaf. The old gods never protected you, but the Lord of Light shows you the future. She held the leaf up into the sunlight. With a whoosh, it burst into flame. Watch. This is your destiny, she said, throwing the burning leaf to the ground. The dry red leaves quickly caught fire, crackling as they burned. Startled, Amos kicked the leaves away and hid next to the Red Witch. She smiled at him, her eyes glowing. The leaves burned out, but the fire spread to the felled weirwood stump and ignited it. The Red Witch stepped forward and waved her hand over the flames. With a hiss, the fire roared to life and engulfed the stump. The Red Witch smiled and gestured invitingly to Amos. Half believing, half skeptical, Amos approached the burning weirwood and stared into the flames. The heat was intense, making it hard to breathe. As he watched, a vision formed in the fire. Amos' tense expression relaxed as he became mesmerized by the sight. No one knew what he saw, but he was convinced. The Red Witch placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered in his ear, Do you believe now? Amos nodded, spellbound. I believe that the Lord of Light is the one true God. He suddenly remembered something. Prepare the sacrifices, as many as needed. 50 will suffice, the Red Witch replied, her eyes shimmering. But they must be pure bloodlines of the ancestors. Who will meet the requirements? Amos asked. You recently married. I remember you have a bastard son. Use him, Amos agreed without hesitation. As you wish, my lord. The Red Witch bowed, her robe parting to reveal curves that glowed like flames. Amos watched her greedily before turning to True. True, come here. True approached reluctantly with a bitter expression on his face. The Red Witch walked past him and True quickened his pace, bowing his head. His intuition screamed that she was dangerous, very dangerous. Amos, still staring at the flames, ordered, prepare all the stored wildfire and tell the soldiers to carry it to the walls. Catapults were ready on the walls. Amos planned to use them to hurl wildfire at the dragon. True didn't dare argue. He followed orders without question, his spirit was already broken by forced servitude. Chapter 241, Bracken's End. Time passed slowly, inching toward dusk. On the hillside, Rhaegar lay on the soft grass, hands behind his head, staring up at the sky. Beside him, the cannibal rested with forepaws on the ground, neck stretched, eyes closed. Both master and dragon were relaxed. As the evening breeze tousled his hair, Rhaegar shook his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He watched the flaming clouds and the setting sun, waiting for it to disappear completely. This would mark the end of Bracken's last moments of peace and fear. Then, he would ride the cannibal and replicate Aegon the Conqueror's fiery destruction of Harrenhal. No castle, no matter how impregnable, could withstand dragon fire. At the base of the hill, the armies stood ready. Syrinx and Dreamfire lay prostrate, vigilantly watching the cannibal. The dragon exuded a dense and terrifying aura, flames building within its chest. Sister, the sun is setting, Helaena said, her white eyes fixed on the horizon. Rhaenyra held her small hand, also gazing at the sunset. Rhaegar's declaration had spread throughout the army, Bracken's end would come at sunset. Getting no response, Helaena shook her sister's hand and furrowed her brow. Brother is not happy. We must help him. Rhaenyra looked at her in surprise, taken aback by her sensitivity. After a moment of thought, she said seriously, Rhaegar can handle it himself. Oh, okay, Helaena replied, frowning and kicking the grass at her feet. Stone hedge. In the forest of the sacred trees, green fire blazed, accompanied by the faint screams of agony and the sound of burning flesh. Outside the forest, True trembled with fear and looked around nervously before sneaking back into the castle. Inside the castle walls, chaos reigned. Soldiers frantically carried buckets of wildfire into the fortifications. One commander shouted, "Tell the civilians to sift the sand. The moving wildfire needs a bed of sand." Wildfire, an extremely unstable explosive, was stored in sealed wooden barrels lined with fine sand to prevent shaking and accidental explosions. True moved with small, furtive steps, his eyes darting around as he kept his hands hidden in his sleeves, wringing them anxiously. Commanders and soldiers noticed the bear-like former maester. One commander asked with a sullen expression, "What are you doing here? You should be in the cellar making wildfire." "No, the Lord told me to come," True stammered, lying. The commander looked at him skeptically. "Why did the Lord call you for?" "I am the maker of wildfire. I'm here to help you move it efficiently," True replied, his voice shaking. "All you need to move it is sand, and there's no difference between coarse and fine sand," he added, lying down again. Coarse sand, mixed with stones and dirt, did nothing to minimize the shaking. But the commanders and soldiers, ignorant of the intricacies of alchemy, accepted his explanation without question. They were soldiers, not alchemists, and they followed orders without thinking. The commander pretended to think before agreeing. "Okay, let's use coarse sand. Have the civilians bring more." True, his heart pounding, tiptoed away from the castle. He entered a hidden attic and found a secret compartment. Click! The compartment opened and a letter appeared. True read it. "The Bracken house has been forced by a witch to turn their backs on their own beliefs and will be punished. I'm leaving. There's a secret passage in the stables." This letter, left by the old citadel maester, had warned of impending disaster and provided an escape route. True quickly crumpled the letter into a ball, stuffed it into his mouth, and swallowed it. He, too, was preparing to flee. Sunset. The sky turned golden as the sun set, casting a final red glow over the horizon. On the hillside, the cannibal shook and spread its massive wings like a black curtain against the sky. Its neck stretched forward and its green pupils flashed with a fierce glow. "It's time," Rhaegar murmured, pushing himself up from the grass and stretching his tired neck. Roar! The cannibal let out a low growl, prostrating itself for its rider. It was eager to unleash its fury on the city below. "Good fellow, you are my companion for life," Rhaegar said, stroking the cannibal's pitch-black scales with a smile as pure as a child's. It was hard to imagine what the Targaryens would be without their dragons. He climbed the soft ladder to the saddle and took a deep breath before yelling, "Cannibal, fly!" Roar! The cannibal roared again, lifting its wings and soaring high into the sky. The sun had completely set. The moon was hidden, and the stars were scarce, shrouding Stonehenge in darkness. "Keep your eyes open and be on the lookout for any enemies sneaking up on you," barked the commander dressed as a knight, patrolling the battlements and scolding the soldiers. The soldiers fell silent and patrolled their surroundings with torches. However, the darkness made it difficult to see beyond a limited area. A taller soldier whispered to his companion, "Do you think the dragon will burn the Lord?" His companion rolled his eyes in disgust. "Before the dragon burns the Lord, it will burn the likes of us first. Fools, worrying about others." Suddenly, the sound of flapping wings filled the air, causing the torches to flicker in the cool wind. "Be alert! The dragon is coming!" the officer shouted, drawing his long sword. The soldiers tensed, held their weapons tightly, and stood back to back, staring into the darkness. But the sound seemed to come from nowhere, and the dragon was nowhere to be seen. A drop of cold sweat trickled down one soldier's cheek as his body shook. He swallowed nervously. The waiting was agonizing. "Listen, the sound's gone," one soldier said in surprise. The others pricked up their ears, realizing that the sound was indeed gone. "Maybe the dragon flew over the wall and ignored us," a soldier muttered hopefully. The soldiers began to relax, thinking that this was a reasonable assumption. Suddenly, a sharp teenage voice shouted, "Dracarys!" The temperature in the air immediately rose. Roar! A muffled dragon roar echoed, followed by ghostly green dragon fire descending upon the battlements. Boom! The dragon fire engulfed the soldiers, turning the night sky an eerie green. A large, blurry figure appeared in the night sky. Above the stone hedge, the cannibal's dark form slowly circled, spewing eerie green dragon fire like mist and water. "Ah! Release the wildfire, the dragon is attacking." "It's too late, run!" On the wall, the Bracken soldiers screamed and wailed, writhing in the dragon fire. "Rhaegar, clad in black robes, rode on the dragon's back and surveyed the devastation below. His lips moved slightly as he murmured, "Burn them all." His words were cold and distant. Roar! The cannibal roared, flapping its wings and circling the city walls, unleashing dragon fire repeatedly. Outside the city, 3 miles away, Samuel and Rob watched and waited patiently. A green fire blazed brightly, growing steadily. Samuel's eyes lit up as he shouted, "Charge! Surround stone hedge! Charge!" The soldiers rushed toward the stone hedge. Their mission was clear: block the gates and let no bracken escape. Stonehenge Castle. The outer walls of the city were engulfed in flames, the soldiers' defences useless as they were consumed by the dragon fire. A short distance away, Amos watched in shock. The giant black dragon roamed the night sky, its dragon fire sweeping the city walls as effortlessly as a maid washing dishes. Amos snapped out of his stupor and shouted angrily, "Bring out the wildfire and aim it at the dragon." He had anticipated that the soldiers in the outer city would not be able to stop the dragon. The flames were hidden, waiting for this moment. The soldiers obeyed his command, carefully pulling out the wildfire and placing it on the stone-throwing carts. Release! With that command, a dozen stone throwers fired in unison, aiming at the dragon in the night sky. Boom boom boom! The distance was too great, the wildfire missed and crashed into the outer city wall. The wildfire seemed to merge with the dragon fire, indistinguishable. This caught Rhaegar's attention. With the help of the spreading fire, he saw the stone throwers positioned above and below the city. His eyes narrowed with understanding. Cannibal, attack the inner city! Roar! The cannibal stopped its dragon fire attack, raised its wings, and flew toward the inner city, spewing fire at the stone throwers. The speed of the dragon fire was far greater than the soldiers' attempts to start a wildfire. The intense heat caused the wildfire to detonate before it could even reach its target. The next second, a rumble. Buckets of wildfire exploded, echoing through Stonehenge City. Green flames shot into the sky. Ah! The wildfire exploded. It's hot! Run away! The wildfire spread even more fiercely than the cannibal's dragon fire. In an instant, the walls of city were surrounded by blazing wildfire. Rhaegar raised an eyebrow at the unexpected benefit. Amos had indeed been foolish to think he could use wildfire against a dragon. Wildfire, an unstable alchemical product, was no match for a dragon that controlled the skies. The heat of the wildfire was unbearable, and the soldiers burned alive, screaming and writhing in agony. After pondering for a moment, Rhaegar gave the order, "Cannibal, fly to the castle." The sticky nature of the wildfire meant that once the city was surrounded, the people inside would never escape unscathed. He was going to the Brackenhouse castle to fulfill his promise. Today the Brackenhouse bloodline would be over. Cannibal flapped its wings, its pupils flashing with disgust at the wildfire, and flew away. The dragon found the foul, putrid odor of the wildfire nauseating, a poor imitation of its own dragon fire. Chapter 242, The End of the Road. In the inner city, hiding in a stone-built chamber, covering his mouth and nose with one hand, Amos cried out in panic, "Where is the Red Witch?" "I'm not sure, my lord. She seems to be performing rituals in the Godswood forest," the knight replied, fear in his voice. "My lord, there are still many fires in the city. We must flee quickly. The recent explosion was only from a few barrels outside. If the fire spread, the rising temperatures would ignite the forest fires stored inside the city. At that point, everyone would be burned alive." Amos looked desperate, grasping at straws. "Yes. There are still sacrifices. The Lord of Light will bless me." Shouting, he pulled a token from his pocket. "Come with me, there are secret passages. We can escape through them." As a member of the Bracken clan, Amos knew of the numerous tunnels his ancestors had dug beneath Stonehenge Castle for just such an emergency. As he led his men down the stairs, the temperature rose, the air thick with the stench of burning wildfire. "My lord, the wildfire is still in the cellar," a soldier tending to the wildfire reported, rushing toward them. Amos shoved him away and ran toward a secret side passageway, yelling, "Never mind that. I have to find the Red Witch first." He firmly believed that once the Red Witch's ritual was complete, the Lord of Light would grant him the power to defeat the Targaryens and their dragon. None of the remaining soldiers dared to handle the wildfire, so they followed Amos, fleeing through the secret passage. Thousands of them moved noisily towards the escape route, a frantic procession. In the cellar, The cellar lay directly below them. As the soldiers' footsteps increased, the stone walls of the cellar shook. Click! Tiny bits of dirt shook loose and fell onto the sand-covered floor. Wooden shelves lined both sides of the cellar, neatly stacked with barrels of wildfire, cushioned by sand. Knock, knock! The footsteps of the fleeing soldiers grew louder, causing the cellar walls to shake slightly. Normally, this kind of shaking wouldn't be a problem. The barrels holding the wildfire were relatively stable, cushioned with fine sand to absorb vibrations. However, half of the barrels were lined with coarse sand mixed with rocks and mud, creating an uneven cushion. As the shaking continued, the barrels bumped against the rocks and mud. They were in danger of exploding. Boom! A barrel of wildfire suddenly exploded, setting off a chain reaction as the remaining barrels exploded. Green flames blossomed in unison, a deadly dance of destruction. In the secret tunnel, separated by a mere wall, soldiers were still evacuating, packed tightly together. The explosion echoed. Bang! The tunnel erupted, wildfire spreading like a ravenous beast, consuming the entire passage. Ah, wildfire! Don't touch me, it's burning. My face! The narrow secret passage became an inferno, instantly engulfing hundreds of soldiers. Cries of despair and agony pierced the night. Outside the secret passage, Amos, leading over 300 men, had already fled the inner city and huddled in a remote corner of the outer wall. They waited for more soldiers to appear, but a sudden heat wave swept through the passage. Buzz! A soldier halfway out was engulfed in the wildfire, his body lit like a human torch. Ah! Help me, help me! The flames consumed him and he fell back into the passage. The wildfire continued to rage, flames shooting over 10 meters into the air. The searing heat wave knocked Amos and his men down. Run, run! Seeing the dire situation, Amos scrambled away from the exit, panic in his eyes. Half an hour later, the wildfire's fury began to subside, and soldiers slowly climbed to their feet. Amos turned back, witnessing the fall of the inner city. Wildfire burned from the inside out, green flames reaching tens of meters high, turning Stonehenge Castle into a giant torch. In the night, it was a beacon of ruin. It's over, there's no going back. Amos stood frozen, murmuring in disbelief. The inner city had fallen, cutting off their retreat to the castle. They were trapped between the inner and outer cities. My lord, the only way out now is to break through, the knight suggested, holding Amos's arm. The Targaryen dragon was still circling in the night sky. Without an urgent escape plan, they would be reduced to ashes before dawn. Amos gripped the token tightly, his knuckles white. There's an ambush by the Blackwood family in the outer city. Better to fight and have a chance to escape, the Bracken knight urged, seeing no other option. Amos closed his eyes, fear shaking him. All right, let's break out. Lord Amos commands, open the gates and break through. The Bracken knight's cry echoed, rallying the remnants. They moved to open the city gates and lower the drawbridge. Godswood Forest. The sacrificial wildfire gradually died out, leaving only ash and bone fragments on the ground. The Red Witch knelt before the remains, clasping her hands as she chanted, "Blessed be the Lord of Light." As she recited a series of fervent prayers, her youthful face began to age. In a few short breaths, she went from a vibrant woman in her 20s to an elderly crone, her face lined with deep wrinkles. Unaware of the change, the Red Witch scooped up some of the ash and smeared it on her aged face, continuing to pray with intense devotion. The ashes spread evenly over her skin, covering her face and neck. Then a miraculous transformation took place. The wrinkles disappeared, her skin became smooth, and she regained her youthful appearance, looking even younger than before, like a petite girl in her late teens. Haha, it worked, she laughed sharply, feeling the change. The fancy priest didn't lie to me. Her laughter faded, replaced by a cautious look. I have to get out of here. Having achieved her goal, she knew it was time to save herself. As for her lover, Amos Bracken, he was nothing more than a foolish tool. Once used, he could be discarded. Rising to her feet, she lifted the hem of her red gown and ran toward the castle. After some time, the Red Witch, using the cover of night, reached the vicinity of the horse shed at the back of the castle. Rustle! A loud noise made her freeze. She quickly hid behind the edge of a well and peered out. In the darkness of the porch, a tall, stocky figure emerged from the haystacks, clumsily brushing off the straw and hanging his head in despair. The Red Witch recognized him at once, the ex-maester, a dim-witted fatman with traces of giant blood. An idea flashed in her eyes. She called out, "Who's there?" Roar. Instead of a human response, a muffled dragon roar answered her. Whoosh. The black dragon flapped its wings, creating gusts that scattered the straw on the shed as it hovered over the castle. On the dragon's back, Rhaegar frowned as he heard faint sounds below. Looking down at the castle, he saw no lights, only an eerie silence. "Cannibal, land," he commanded. Rhaegar decided not to act rashly and burn the castle immediately. His mission had a purpose. Take Stonehenge Castle. Wipe out the Bracken House. Execute Amos Bracken. Taking the city was the first priority. Stonehenge was a valuable stronghold, a noble territory with significant worth. Securing it intact was far more beneficial than reducing it to ashes. Boom! Cannibal landed on the horse corridor, crushing several fragile haylofts beneath its feet. As soon as he dismounted, Rhaegar spotted two figures hiding in the shadows of the porch. "Come out, or my dragon will breathe dragon fire," he commanded, his voice deep and authoritative. "Yes, honorable prince." Tall and round, True stumbled out and fell to his knees in the mud. His escape had been thwarted by Amos' orders to seal the secret passageway near the castle, trapping him. The Red Witch stepped out hesitantly, trembling. Her wide eyes were fixed on the massive dragon, her legs weak with fear. She cursed her luck, knowing that her earlier scream had drawn the dragon's attention. Rhaegar's brow furrowed in surprise as he observed the pair, a burly man in a grey robe with no maester's chain, and a red-robed witch, a demonic figure of beauty. The Red Witch especially piqued his interest. She reminded him of another red-robed woman he had encountered in the Vale, one who had a Shadowcat as a companion and wielded strange powers. With that in mind, Rhaegar pulled out a ruby necklace and addressed the Red Witch, "Do you recognize this?" His tone was deceptively simple, meant to test her. The Red Witch looked up tentatively, her eyes first on Rhaegar's handsome face, then on the necklace. When she saw the ruby, her eyes widened and she blurted out, "Flaming red heart." "So you recognize it," Rhaegar said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The Red Witch's breathing quickened, her eyes filled with longing. "This gem is one of the heirlooms of the Temple of Arhillar, lost during the last Valyrian invasion of Lys. Arhillar, the Lord of Light, was widely worshipped in the Free Cities, with one of the largest temples standing in Lys." Rhaegar shook the necklace in curiosity. "What does it do?" "Immunity to fire." "No, no, no. That would be a waste," she replied, her voice trembling with excitement. "According to the High Priestess, the flaming red heart allows the wearer to communicate with the gods and have their heart's desires fulfilled." Rhaegar tossed the necklace at her feet. "Try it and see what it does," he said indifferently. Cannibal, attuned to Rhaegar's thoughts, bristled, its dragon's maw pointed at the Red Witch, ready to unleash fire at a moment's notice. The Red Witch, oblivious to the threat, crawled forward and grabbed the necklace, her eyes glued to the ruby. "Great Arhillar, your faithful servant!" She prayed fervently, clutching the ruby in her hands. But nothing happened. The ruby remained cold, and no miracle occurred. "How can this be?" she muttered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Growing impatient, Rhaegar demanded, "Did it work or not?" Cannibal lowered its head, its fiery breath heating the air. "Yes, it will," the Red Witch stammered, a chill running down her spine. Panicking, she added, "Perhaps it has been too long without a sacrifice, and it needs one to regain its power." Rhaegar's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What kind of sacrifice?" Uncertain about the beliefs of foreign religions like Arhillar, he scrutinized her closely. The Red Witch, seeing a potential ally in Rhaegar, tried to smile. "The sacrifice is..." Suddenly, a sharp knife pierced her chest from behind, cutting her off mid-sentence. Blood flowed freely as her body froze in shock. She turned her head with great difficulty to see the frightened yet determined face of True, the disgraced maester. With a final twitch, she collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Rhaegar watched with quiet interest, having seen True's move but choosing not to intervene. The Red Witch's failure to demonstrate the ruby's power had rendered it useless. After killing her, True dropped the dagger in fear, his stomach heaving with deep breaths. Trembling, he picked up the fallen ruby and held it out with both hands, his voice tinged with desperation. "Honorable Prince, that woman was a liar. She killed many people." True had been forced to act, unable to let the Red Witch deceive and possibly harm more people. He understood the danger she posed, especially if she gained influence over a royal heir. Rhaegar, however, was only interested in the ruby's potential for fire magic. The Targaryens had no need for ritual, they commanded dragons. Amused by the contrast between True's hulking physique and his gentle demeanor, Rhaegar asked, "Who are you, dressed like a maester?" "Prince, my name is True," he replied, bowing his head respectfully. He explained his humble origins in the Riverlands and his brief time at the Citadel, where he had studied until a failed wildfire experiment led to his expulsion. Rhaegar measured True carefully, impressed by his intellect despite his unassuming appearance. "Where are the members of the Bracken house hiding?" he inquired. "In the cellar of the castle," True replied eagerly. "There are many civilians in the castle, driven there by Lord Amos. I can gather some men and capture the Bracken house." Rhaegar, intent on preserving the castle, agreed to True's plan. "Go ahead." "Yes, Lord," True replied, setting out to carry out his orders. Outside Stonehenge Castle, the drawbridge lowered with a heavy thud, and Amos, flanked by his soldiers, fled with desperate speed. The outer walls were engulfed in dragon fire and wildfire, even a stray spark could mean certain death. Under the cover of night, over 300 soldiers stumbled into the muddy grass, their path obscured by the darkness. Panic and confusion reigned as they struggled to find their way. "Oh oh!" The mournful note of a horn echoed across the open meadow. Emerging from the night, 2,000 Blackwood soldiers advanced, their presence a grim reminder of the futility of flight. Chapter 243, Exchange for Harrenhal. A sharp dragon roar pierced the night air. Orange and yellow dragon fire, interwoven with the sky, cut through the darkness, raining down on the soldiers of the Bracken house. "Ah! There's an ambush! Run away!" The dragon fire's intense heat and immense impact were irresistible. The already weakened Bracken soldiers were incinerated or scattered like dust. On the ground, Samwell's army surged forward, crashing into the enemy ranks. "Make this quick! Don't let any of them escape!" Samwell's long sword swung with deadly precision, cutting down any soldier who dared to resist. His lean figure moved with lethal grace through the chaos. Above, 2 dragons circled, their presence casting a grim shadow over the one-sided slaughter below. 2,000 Blackwood soldiers against 300 Bracken men. Victory was inevitable. 20 minutes later, the melee ended. Every Bracken soldier lay dead, with Samwell's men ensuring none were feigning death. "Let go of me, Blackwood scum!" Amos lay in a pool of blood, helpless and alone, struggling futilely against his captors. "Amos, good to see you again." Samwell, eyes blazing with fury, kicked Amos in the stomach, sending him sprawling. "Ah! Damn Blackwoods!" Amos screamed, clutching his stomach in agony. Samwell, breathing heavily, grabbed Amos by the hair, pressing his long sword to his throat. "Amos, I killed your brother, and you won't get away with it." Amos's brother had been the last lord of the Bracken family. To curry favor with Rhaenyra, he had provoked several Blackwood children. A teenage Samwell had slain him in a tournament. "Little bastard, kill me if you dare," Amos spat, trying to salvage some dignity. "You think you have a chance to live?" Samwell's grip tightened, ready to decapitate him. "Wait, leave him for the prince," Robb interjected, grabbing Amos, who had resigned himself to death. At the mention of Rhaegar, Samwell paused, his expression hardening. "It's too merciful to kill him with one stroke." With a final kick to Amos's face, Samwell vented his rage. The soldiers secured Amos to a flagpole, their grim procession heading toward the burning city of Stonehenge. The feud between the Blackwoods and Brackens, as well as the personal vendettas, demanded more than a swift death. On the other side, True gathered over 100 civilians and stormed Bracken House's castle. After a chaotic smash and grab, more than 10 nobles in fancy dress were dragged out. "Get out of here, you scum!" The peasants, filled with rage, hurled curses and assaulted the nobles with punches and kicks. They had been oppressed by the Brackens, and their hearts were full of fear and resentment. They wanted to burn the castle to the ground. The members of Bracken House, gagged and helpless, could only plead for mercy, which earned them more beatings. The Bracken House was utterly destroyed. Rhaegar circled over the castle on his dragon, Cannibal, closing his eyes to the night wind. The Targaryen was true to his word, if he vowed to end a bloodline, he would follow through. Half a month later, a high platform was set up in a busy marketplace. Lionel, his arm in a sling, pointed to a crowd of people kneeling before him, fervently explaining their crimes. The Blackwood House waged a private war and disobeyed the king's orders. After a long proclamation, he announced the verdict: Kellen Blackwood is deprived of his lordship and is sentenced to death by garroting. Turning to Kellen, he asked aloud, "Prisoner, do you accept the sentence?" "Yes, Lord Hand of the King," Kellen replied in a low voice. "But I do not wish to die immediately. Please allow me to don the black robe and guard the Great Wall." The crowd watched expectantly. Lionel nodded and granted the request. The king's guard draped a black robe over Kellen and led him away from the execution ground. This decision was the result of long negotiations. Kellen pleaded guilty, and the Blackwoods ceded some territory near the Red Fork River. In exchange, Kellen was allowed to live, and his eldest son, Samwell, inherited the title and the land. With the Blackwoods dealt with, the Brackens were next. Lionel declared their sins: waging war, disobeying the king, murdering Lord Graves Tully, Lord Tully's heir, and defying the hand of the king, Lionel Strong. The Bracken house was sentenced to death. Every man, woman, and child was beheaded, and their heads were thrown into the moat. Amos Bracken, the chief culprit, was stripped of his title and territory, his clothes torn from him, and he was whipped all the way to the dragon pit. On the journey, he was scorned by the common people and pelted with filth. When he reached the dragon pit, covered in grime, cannibal awaited him. The dragon's flames burned him to ash. The people of King's Landing knew of the Bracken House's rebellions and transgressions. They became the epitome of traitors. Prince Rhaegar, who managed to put down the rebellion, was hailed as a hero by all. Red Keep. In the bedroom, Rhaegar sat at a table, head down, writing furiously. Knock, knock. There was a soft knock at the door, followed by Rhaenyra's voice. Rhaegar, I'm coming in. She entered without waiting for an answer. Compared to half a month ago, Rhaenyra looked even more radiant. Her long silver gold hair flowed smoothly, woven into a slender braid. She wore a fitted black dress that revealed her ankles, and a pair of exquisite red-bottomed high heels. Rhaegar looked up at the sound of her voice, revealing dark circles under his eyes. He saw 3 blurry images of his sister. Supporting his head with one hand, he said, "Rhaenyra, I'm dizzy. You are too tired. You should rest," she said, gently dragging her brother to the bed and laying him down, rubbing his head. Rhaegar obediently closed his eyes and rested his head on his sister's smooth, white thighs, savoring the comfort. He hadn't had a moment's rest since breaking through the stone hedge. He had spent days placating the townspeople, dispersing the townsfolk at the gates, and holding back the remnants of Bracken's forces. For 3 days, he had extinguished the fires in the city, sent men to clear the ruins, and cleared the streets. And that wasn't all. Bracken, as a lord's house, had numerous subordinate families and knightly houses. Some needed to be punished, others accepted. Rhaegar had to oversee the Bracken vaults, granaries, and tax records, ensuring every detail was correct. It was exhausting. "Rhaenyra, if I have to do this every day as king, I'd rather abdicate to you," Rhaegar said, lying as still as a corpse. "You're the only one who works this hard," Rhaenyra said, tapping him affectionately on the nose. "These tasks shouldn't be left to the heir alone. There were advisors for that. But the House Bracken, with its ancient legacy, demanded careful handling. Rhaegar trusted no one else with it. Managing the money, the food, and the ownerless stone hedge required his watchful eye. Without him, local nobles might take advantage of the situation. Checking finances and keeping records was the job of Lord Lyman Beesbury, the master of coin. But Lyman, old and inefficient, couldn't keep up. Needing the resources of Stonehenge, Rhaegar took on the task. Had he done it alone, he might have collapsed from exhaustion. Fortunately, he had the help of his followers. After resting for a while, Rhaegar's headache subsided. He rubbed his face against Rhaenyra's smooth thighs for comfort. This was how a prince should be treated. The corners of Rhaenyra's mouth turned up and her eyes flashed with triumph. Dressing up had been worth it. Rhaegar, understanding her motives, still enjoyed the warmth. He was tired and dizzy, but not stupid. Time passed quietly. Rhaenyra's eyes sparkled as she asked softly, "Rhaegar, you seem so attached to Stonehenge. Do you have any ideas?" Compared to the Blackwoods, who lost only a piece of territory, the Bracken house was utterly destroyed. Their direct lineage was executed, and their titles, castles, and territories returned to the crown. Rhaegar sidled over, hugging her white thighs. "Yes, I want to find a territory for myself, he said. You're the heir, and the prince's palace is still under construction, Rhaenyra said suspiciously. Rhaegar shook his head, saying no more. The prince's palace was just a residence with scarce territory, population, and resources. His true fiefdom should be Dragonstone, now given to Rhaenyra. He felt it was only right. However, he still needed a rich land for his fiefdom. The riverlands were ideal, fertile, populous, and close to the crownlands. Seeing his reluctance to speak, Rhaenyra pinched his cheek and kissed him lightly on the forehead. Rest now. There is a celebration banquet this evening. Nightfall. Inside the Red Keep, the lights glowed brightly, illuminating the steady stream of guests. Viserys sat at the head of the table, smiling broadly as he accepted the flattery and toasts of his subjects. The long-dormant royal family had destroyed an ancient house of the Riverlands in one fell swoop. No matter how much the nobles had despised the young king in the past, they now had to put aside their petty thoughts and show the respect due to his strong heir. After the toasts, the feast began. Rhaegar and Lionel sat on either side of Viserys. Rhaegar was the first to speak. Lord Lionel, I have some business to discuss with you. Go ahead, Prince, Lionel replied, holding a wine glass, his expression turning solemn. Rhaegar hesitated, locking eyes with his father. Viserys broke into a smile and nodded. Father and son had discussed the matter beforehand and there was no problem. With his father's support, Rhaegar said with a straight face, Lord Lionel, the strong house served their kingdom faithfully, but Harrenhal was burned by the mob. Leonor took a sip of mulled wine, troubled by the situation. Harrenhal had been badly damaged and it would cost a fortune to repair. He was already considering borrowing from the Iron Bank. Seeing Lionel's distress, Rhaegar smiled. The castle at Stonehenge is still intact. What do you think about using it as a replacement? Chapter 244, The First Melting of Black Dragonstone. A few days later. In the Riverlands, at Harrenhal. After half a month, the 5 towers were still dark, and smoke wafted from the remaining ruins of various buildings. Prince, are you sure the dragon will work? Lionel asked, his face troubled, as he watched the Unsullied busily clearing the debris. At the moment, the Unsullied were hauling pieces of rubble from the ruins and throwing them into a large pit about a man's height deep. Besides the rubble, the pit contained ashes pulled from the ruins and a dark, sticky pile of dragon dung. Dragon dung differs from the feces of other creatures. It has a faint odor and fewer solid components. Being magical creatures, dragons' bodies are infused with flame elements. Once cows and sheep enter their stomachs, they are rapidly digested by potent gastric juices, leaving behind black slime that resembles unheated magma. Rhaegar squatted at the edge of the deep pit, stroking his chin as he murmured, "It shouldn't be a problem." He seemed to have thought of something. Waving to Grey Worm, who stood guard nearby, he hesitantly said, "There's a bit too much dragon dung. Have someone scoop out some." "Yes, Prince," Grey Worm replied, calling for 2 Unsullied to scoop out the dragon droppings. A large ladle, about 2 meters long, reached into the pit and scooped up a hefty portion of dragon dung. Rhaegar's eyes lit up. Almost there. According to his knowledge of the blood sorcery Dragonstone, it was roughly the ratio of a small amount of dragon dung mixed with a large quantity of stones and mortar. "Prince, using dragon dung to create black stone. I've never heard of it," Lionel said helplessly. Rhaegar replied thoughtfully, "Of course, it's not just dragon dung. Dragon scales, dragon blood, dragon bones, and even stones stained with dragon fire are all essential forging materials. Dragonstone was an unorthodox magical artifact, and the melting process required a touch of magic. Dragons were high-level magical creatures, and each part of their body contained enough magical essence to melt dragonstone. While dragon scales, blood, and bones were too precious, dragon dung was an abundant and inexpensive alternative. In the lore of Dragonstone, the dragon lords of Valyria had used dragon dung to build black stone wonders. It was sturdy, durable, and had no bad odor. With the ingredients ready, the show was about to begin. The cannibal, hovering in the sky, slowly descended, scanning the deep pit with disdain. This was where the dragon dung came from. Rhaegar stepped away from the pit, approached the cannibal, and commanded, "Dracarys! Roar!" The cannibal snorted, unleashing a torrent of dragon fire into the pit. Zira! Under the intense heat, the debris in the pit began to melt, mixing with the ashes and dragon droppings. Rhaegar placed both hands on the cannibal's scales, closed his eyes, and murmured a low incantation. Soon, the gurgling sound of boiling liquid emerged from the pit. The cannibal ceased his drag on fire, and Rhaegar opened his eyes. An Unsullied stepped forward to inspect the pit and exclaimed, "Prince, it seems to have worked." Rhaegar, thrilled by the news, rushed forward to see for himself. The materials in the pit had transformed into a bubbling black magma. The temperature of the magma was not extremely high, comparable to boiling water. There was no discernible odor. "Quick, bring the molds," Rhaegar shouted, instructing for stone molds about a meter long and half a meter wide to be brought over. The Unsullied used a large ladle to scoop the black magma and pour it into the molds. As they worked, Rhaegar noticed a key characteristic of the substance: it solidified rapidly. As soon as it was scooped out, white smoke began to rise from the ladle, and when poured into the stone trough, it quickly hardened into black dragon stone, fitting perfectly to the mold. Rhaegar smiled, tapping on the surface of the black dragon stone. Clang! The sound was hard and solid, the material firm. Turning back to Lionel, he raised an eyebrow triumphantly. "How is it, my lord?" Lionel was too shocked to speak, his face a mix of awe and solemnity. Despite the magical element involved, witnessing this art in person was astonishing. Lionel raised his trembling hand and said excitedly, "This method truly deserves to be called the knowledge of Valyria. It's simply unheard of and unseen." In Westeros, current construction techniques still relied on stonemasons and masons. Stonemasons shaped boulders, while masons mixed mortar from straw ash and yellow clay. This process was slow and labor-intensive. A single stonemason could work all day and carve only a few useful stones. Black dragon stone required only stone, mortar, and dragon droppings, fused together in moments and molded into any desired shape. Rhaegar's eyes sparkled with anticipation. That's not all. He instructed the Unsullied to scoop out another ladle of black magma and pour it onto the molded black dragon stone. Zira. When the black magma met the black dragon stone, a hot white smoke rose, quickly dissipating as the magma solidified and fused seamlessly with the stone. This demonstrated that black dragon stone could be formed using an infusion method rather than traditional construction techniques. Lionel looked stunned, nearly dropping his jaw in disbelief. It took him a moment to gather himself. Shaking his head, he chuckled, "Prince, no wonder you wanted to trade the intact stone hedge for Harrenhal." Harrenhal had been burned to the ground, rendering it unfit for nobility. At a dinner party a few days prior, Lionel had agreed to the exchange of territories. The Strongs would move to the former Bracken lands, inheriting Stonehenge and most of its territory, while Harrenhal and its lands reverted to the crown, with Rhaegar receiving the title of Lord for life. Lionel was pleased with the arrangement. Despite Harrenhal's ruin, Stonehenge, although smaller and less strategically located, was an excellent choice. The territory and its people were richer than those under the Strong House. Harrenhal held a significant position in Westeros, overseeing the Riverlands, defending the Vale, and the Northern Realm. However, its history was cursed, with none of its past lords meeting a good end. Lionel was more than willing to exchange his family's land for Stonehenge, reducing risks and reintegrating into the Riverlands' noble power. With these considerations in mind, Lionel said, "Prince, the Strong House will take over Stonehenge, and old Lord Tully and I will ensure the stone supply needed to rebuild Harrenhal." Harrenhal's complex had been reduced to ruins, with only the 5 main towers and the city wall remaining intact. To smelt the black dragon stone, a steady supply of stone was required. This task was undertaken by the Tully and Strong houses. The Strong House, having traded prime land for the royal family, naturally needed to contribute. The Tullys, on the other hand, needed to compensate. With the Blackwoods and Brackens at war and one openly rebelling, Old Tully, as Lord Paramount of the Trident and Lord of Riverrun, had nearly been captured by his own bannermen. His title was spared only because the Tully house had lost its successor. While he had no great merits, he had endured much. Thus, Old Tully had to contribute a significant amount of stone to repair Harrenhal. After the successful creation of Black Dragon Stone, Rhaegar had more pressing matters to attend to. Inside the King's Pyre Tower, Rhaegar took his seat at the high chair. Besides Lionel, a few others joined him, Robb, Grey Worm, and True, the former maester. "Robb," Rhaegar called out. Robb knelt on one knee, his voice reverent, "Prince." Rhaegar exchanged a glance with Lionel before continuing, "Robb, you distinguished yourself in the battles on Stone Island and in the rebellion. I've asked my father for the recognition you deserve." Robb's head lifted, his eyes full of excitement. He had already heard from Samwell, who had been made Lord of Raventree Hall, that the prince intended to honor him. It seemed that Rhaegar intended to make him a sworn knight, possibly paving the way for land and a castle of his own. Lionel cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. His eyes questioned Rhaegar, who nodded, allowing Lionel to speak. With Rob's eyes full of expectation, Lionel solemnly announced, by the king's will and royal decree, Robb Rivers is granted the title of Lord of Stone Mill. Lord. Rob's hands shook in disbelief. That's right, Lord of Stone Mill, Rhaegar confirmed with a smile. Don't worry, I'll fund the construction of your castle from my private coffers. You won't be living in a thatched cottage. Rob's eyes welled with tears of gratitude. Thank you, Your Grace, and thank you, Prince. Though it was the lowest title of nobility, it was still a title, far above the status of a sworn knight. Stone Mill, a territory ceded by the Blackwoods, was fertile land on the north bank of the Red Fork River, ideal for farming and fishing. Now, it's not fitting for a man to cry, Rhaegar admonished gently. With your new title, you can change your family name, design a family crest, and shed the identity of a bastard. Yes, Prince. Robb nodded vigorously, holding back tears. After the ceremony, Rhaegar signaled for Robb to take his leave. The appointment of Robb as a lord was both a reward for loyalty and a strategic move to win the support of other second sons. Stone Mill's location between Blackwood and Strong territory also served as a buffer to prevent conflicts. Rhaegar had no fear of Robb's loyalty waning, as the territory's strategic position ensured a delicate balance of power. Next, Rhaegar turned his attention to Grey Worm. Grey Worm, he called. Grey Worm stepped forward, striking the ground with his spear in salute. Grey Worm, do you know how to train the Unsullied? Rhaegar asked directly. Grey Worm hesitated, unsure how to respond. Rhaegar quickly clarified, I mean the physical fitness and combat training of the Unsullied, without the need for erasing individuality or castration. With a new territory, Rhaegar needed a strong armed force, and there were none better than the Unsullied. Grey Worm breathed a sigh of relief. It can be done, but there is an age limit. Training is most effective before the age of 16. The Unsullied were trained from a young age, developing their unwavering discipline. Training older individuals whose bodies and minds were already set, was far less effective. Don't worry, Rhaegar assured him. I'll support you fully. Among the freed slaves were many children and teenagers. Additionally, Flea Bottom was teeming with orphans and bastard children. There was no shortage of potential recruits for their new army. Chapter 245, The Storm in King's Landing. After discussing the training program, Rhaegar outlined Grey Worm's new duties. He tasked Grey Worm with relocating thousands of slaves from outside King's Landing to Harrenhal. Additionally, Grey Worm was to oversee the selection of new soldiers from Flea Bottom. True to his nature, Grey Worm was swift and efficient, leaving the hall immediately to begin his assignments. Now, only True, the disgraced maester, remained. Rhaegar had not interacted much with him but knew True was an introverted and timid man. Despite his demeanor, True possessed an impressive array of knowledge, earning chains of black iron, bronze, silver and the rare Valyrian steel signifying expertise in ravenology, astronomy, medicine, and magic and occultism, respectively. The Valyrian steel link was particularly prestigious, awarded to only 1 in 100 students. True's fascination with magic and the occult led him to secretly develop wildfire, resulting in his expulsion from the citadel. When Rhaegar inquired about his aspirations, True revealed he had no grand ambitions. Instead, he preferred a quiet life, focused on scientific research. His current goal was simply to find a stable place to live and work. Recognizing True's potential, Rhaegar decided to utilize his talents. He assigned True to stay at Harrenhal, starting with the smelting of black dragon stone. Rhaegar handed over the necessary spells to True, trusting him with the task. To motivate True further, Rhaegar made a solemn promise, when Harrenhal and the Dragon's Nest are completed, I will write to the Hightower House and help you regain your position at the Citadel, restoring your status as a maester. The Hightowers, who controlled Old Town where the Citadel was located, would likely honor such a request. Helping a disgraced maester was a minor favor for them. Yes, Prince. I promise to complete the mission, True replied, his excitement palpable as his belly trembled. For True, a commoner who had risen to become a maester, regaining his diploma was the highest honor. It was more important to him than anything else. Nightfall. Bonfires blazed along the walls of Harrenhal, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Rhaegar rode his dragon, cannibal, towards the north shore of Lake God's Eye. The shore was illuminated by firelight, where a makeshift lumber mill had been set up. Strong laborers carried timber to the carpenters, their silhouettes flickering in the firelight. "Come on, cannibal," Rhaegar murmured, his gaze lingering on the bustling scene for a moment before he directed his dragon to take flight towards the Isle of Faces. The dragon's nest had been a childhood dream of his. Now, the geothermal heat of the Isle of Faces made it the ideal location to bring this dream to life. However, transporting the necessary materials required ships. The timber mill was the first step in this process, with plans for a shipyard and dock to follow. During the reign of Harren the Black, shipyards and docks had been constructed on the north shore of God's Eye, used to repel enemies approaching from both sides of the lake. These defences had caused significant losses to Aegon the Conqueror's forces. But Rhaegar had no intention of building a navy. His sole aim was to secure ships for transporting materials to the Isle of Faces. Cannibal soared over the expansive waters of Lake God's Eye, eventually descending above the Isle of Faces. With a powerful flap of its wings, the dragon landed gently. Rhaegar dismounted and made his way directly to the hot spring. Over the past month, the hot spring had undergone a remarkable transformation. Once the size of a small basin, it had expanded to several meters in diameter. A fish beam tree had been engulfed by the spring's range, its entire root system submerged, turning it into a tree in the water. The spring's water was crystal clear, steaming with white vapor. The roots of the fish beam tree clung to the ground, while the human-like face carved into its trunk twisted in a hauntingly beautiful manner. "Ah, the underground temperature keeps rising. A dragon's nest here is definitely feasible," Rhaegar breathed out, taking off his clothes as he approached the hot spring. With a splash, he jumped into the water, leaning against the tree's rhizome and closing his eyes in contentment. "Ah!" he sighed, the hot water soothing his muscles as he stretched out his legs. The spring's heat was perfect for him, gradually lulling him into a drowsy state. King's Landing. The Red Keep, the King's Chambers. After a round of passionate exertion, the room was filled only with the sound of ragged breathing. Viserys lay on his back, chest heaving, too exhausted to open his eyes. He often found himself grateful to his eldest son, feeling as if his body were 20 years younger since the festering wounds had healed. "Viserys, I've lost my voice. Get me a glass of water," Alicent murmured, nestled in her husband's arms. Her skin, even more radiant than that of a young girl, flushed a delicate pink. Her voice was hoarse, a soft request escaping her lips. Despite her distaste for her husband's often sullen demeanor, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was destined to bear him 5 children. "Drink slowly, Alicent," Viserys gasped, lovingly supporting her as he poured a glass of water and brought it to her lips. Alicent drained the glass in one gulp, the tip of her tongue lingering around the rim. Viserys watched, his heart swelling and his vigor returning. "Viserys, there's something I want to talk to you about," Alicent said, her breathing steadying as she prepared to broach the subject. Gathering her closer, Viserys replied contentedly, "Tell me." He had sensed this conversation was imminent, given Alicent's initiation of it. "The children are getting older, and I want you to think about their futures," Alicent began, her delicate face looking up at him imploringly. "Rhaegar, as the eldest, has the prince's palace in Harrenhal, and Rhaenyra has Dragonstone as a fiefdom. The other children have nothing." Her fear was palpable. The first 2 heirs enjoyed the privileges of the court, while her children were left without. Well, almost nothing. Aegon had been appointed as a commander at the Stepstones, but it wasn't enough. Viserys lowered his eyes and tried to remain calm. Reason prevailed. He understood Alicent's concern and acknowledged the imbalance in the treatment of their children. As a father, he had failed to be fair. As king, the balance was even more skewed. Rhaenyra and Rhaegar were the offspring of his late wife Aemma Oren and held a special place in his heart. Emotionally, they eclipsed his other children. Rhaenyra's abdication as heir had been a significant sacrifice, one he had tried to make up for. Rhaegar, the eldest son, was the heir to the kingdom. He was also the Targaryen dynasty's most capable heir at the moment. At the age of 13, he had led a successful campaign against the Triarchy and crushed the rebellion in the Riverlands. Such achievements marked him as one of the greatest prodigies in the history of House Targaryen. If he didn't die young or succumb to madness, he would undoubtedly be a brilliant ruler. Viserys was willing to use all his resources to support such a promising pair of children. Seeing his hesitation, Alicent reached out, rubbed his beard, and spoke softly, "Aegon's working hard in the Stepstones, and he's almost the same age as Rhaegar, isn't he? Helena and her 2 young sons were too young to consider, leaving Aegon as the only viable son. Despite his usual profligacy and unruly behavior, Alicent didn't see Aegon as useless. After all, both Viserys and Daemon had indulged in the pleasures of King's Landing's brothels in their youth and turned out reasonably well. Aegon, after all, had been to war and ridden a dragon. In terms of ability, he was several times better than the heirs of many great families. Viserys hesitated, thinking deeply. To him, Aegon didn't seem fit to be king. As a prince and lieutenant, he might be a better choice. Do you think Aegon deserves a feud? Viserys asked directly, his eyes piercing. Alicent's face lit up as she nodded gently. Viserys rubbed his brow and sighed, if you had told me earlier, I might have kept the stepstones for him. As it is, the realm has no suitable castle for Aegon. A fief was not easily granted. As a prince, Aegon needed a castle, a palace, and enough servants and lords to maintain royal dignity. If there was no spare castle, he'd have to grant an undeveloped piece of land, requiring extensive work to make it livable. It seemed easier for Aegon to stay in King's Landing as a prince in leisure. Alicent understood this and had a plan. Sitting up, she looked him in the eye and said seriously, the Battle of the Stepstones is nearly over, and Aegon can remain there. She always remembered Jane's analysis, the Stepstones were crucial, situated between 2 continents and a major shipping route. With the Triarchy in decline, the danger had significantly decreased. With Aegon in the Stepstones, the treasury would naturally fund the construction of a fortress and maintain a strong presence. It was a perfect fiefdom. Viserys was momentarily stunned. The Stepstones. He murmured. It was a place rife with disputes, but he had someone in mind who was more suited for it. It could be a form of mutual compensation. Alicent gently shook his shoulder and urged, Viserys, what do you think? It's a good suggestion. Let me think about it, Viserys replied, rolling over to cuddle his wife and closing his eyes. Viserys was not a man of swift decisions but rather one prone to delay. Flea bottom. Inside a brothel. Several black-robed figures entered the dimly lit brothel, moving quickly toward a secluded room on the 2nd floor. The door creaked open to reveal an elegant woman with a delicate figure, draped in a thin veil. She sat gracefully, exuding an air of quiet authority. White Worm, I've heard much about you, said the lead figure, lifting his hood to reveal Otto's stern face. Mysaria placed her hands on her lap, her gaze unwavering. Her voice, both magnetic and hoarse, replied, Lord Otto, your reputation precedes you as well. Otto's reputation had suffered greatly as a result of the street cleaning program, and his name had become synonymous with controversy throughout King's Landing. I'll take that as a compliment, Otto said, his eyes twinkling as he took a seat across from Mysaria. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and impassive. Lord Otto, what brings you here? She asked. White Worm Mysaria, the most elusive figure in Flea Bottom, yet privy to the city's secrets, Otto began, his tone candid. I need a spy master. Will you work for me? I'm afraid I cannot, Mysaria replied without hesitation. I have my own allegiances. Otto's eyes narrowed as he responded frankly, Prince Daemon is in jail and won't be coming out anytime soon. The upper echelons of the court knew that Mysaria had once been Daemon's mistress. In 105 AC, shortly after Queen Aemma died giving birth to Rhaegar, Daemon had famously referred to Rhaegar as the heir for a day while celebrating in a brothel with Mysaria and others. Mysaria had been pregnant with Daemon's child at the time, and he had been overjoyed, going so far as to find a dragon's egg to place in the cradle of his unborn child. The egg had originally been intended for Rhaegar, and Rhaenyra had ridden Syrinx to Dragonstone to retrieve it from Daemon. This incident had infuriated King Viserys, who valued the egg deeply. As a result, Viserys had not only banished Daemon from King's Landing but also ordered him to send Mysaria back to Lys. Daemon, unable to withstand the pressure, had complied. Tragically, during her sea voyage, Mysaria's ship encountered a storm, resulting in the miscarriage of her unborn child. This incident had been a significant factor in the first major rift between Viserys and Daemon. Chapter 246, Unexpected Poisoning. Late at night, Otto, clad in black robes, left the brothel and entered the waiting carriage, protected by his guards. My lord, the White Worm is nothing more than a whore, the young servant who drove the carriage grumbled in obvious indignation. Otto removed his hood, his eyes calm. Even if she is a whore with skills, he said lightly. She barely acknowledges your goodwill and acts as if she's your equal, the young squire continued, still offended. As a member of the Hightower house, the nephew of Otto's cousin, he felt a sense of indignation at seeing his uncle bend over backwards for a prostitute. Otto's gaze was deep, his tone measured. Look at the long term. The white maggot is just a minor player, the real focus is on the people behind her. The Targaryen heirs were growing in number and influence, each one a potential player in the kingdom's future. Otto saw the need to plan for princely positions. Rhaegar's grant of Harrenhal had set a precedent, and the other heirs would soon make their moves. Preparing in advance was crucial for maintaining influence at court. His nephew drove the carriage with a half-understood nod. As they neared the edge of Flea Bottom, a mocking voice sounded. Master of piss and shit, go eat shit. The young servant recoiled and looked around in shock. Splat! A bucket of feces and urine fell from above, splashing on the roof of the carriage. Who the hell did that? The squire yelled, drenched and furious, drawing his sword. Stop, don't make trouble, Otto ordered. Hurry up and leave. The white worm will take care of this. Suppressing his anger, the young attendant gritted his teeth. Yes, my lord. He whipped the horse, speeding out of Flea Bottom, leaving behind the jeering crowd. Inside the carriage, Otto covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief, his eyes sweeping over the soiled carport. Slowly, he closed his eyes. King's Landing was a city filled with the stench of poverty and desperation. Refugees from all over the Seven Kingdoms flocked to the capital, hoping for a better life. This influx strained the city's security and exacerbated tensions between nobles and commoners. As Master of Civil Affairs, Otto had taken on the responsibility of cleaning up the streets. His efforts had touched a nerve among the impoverished, leading to widespread resistance. After several failed attempts, he devised a localized approach. The poor resisted the nobles' management, so he sought out individuals from their own ranks to lead them. The White Worm was a grassroots figure with notable talents, one of the main reasons he had gone to such lengths to bring her into his fold. The next day, Viserys lay in bed, contentedly cuddling his beautiful wife, lost in a dream he hated to leave. Alicent, resting on his arm, listened to his familiar snoring, her mind lost in thought. She had been awake all night, planning for the future of her children. A knock at the door broke the morning silence. Your Grace, an urgent report from Stepstones. Came Eric's voice from the hall. Alicent blinked, shaking herself from her reverie. She shook her husband gently, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Viserys, there's a letter from Stepstones. Wake up. Viserys groggily tried to sit up, only to find his right arm numb from his wife's weight. Alicent got up with a worried look on her face, slipped into her nightgown, and opened the door. Eric stood there, his expression grave. Your Grace, he nodded. Come in, tell him what you have, Alicent said, stepping aside to let Eric enter. Eric entered, his eyes averted out of respect. He presented a letter to the king, who was still struggling to fully wake up. All right, give it to me, Viserys muttered, taking the letter and tearing it open. As he read the contents, his expression changed dramatically. Vaemond Velaryon is dead. He cried out in shock. Vaemond is dead. Alicent's eyes widened. Sir Vaemond? She asked, equally surprised. Vaemond was the younger brother of Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, and they were known to be very close. Viserys nodded, his face grave. The letter says Vaemond felt abdominal pains some time ago. At first, he didn't think much of it, but it kept getting worse. 2 nights ago, he collapsed in agony, his abdomen swollen like a basin, and he died in terrible pain. Alicent's mind raced. What about Aegon? Is he all right? Viserys reassured her. Aegon is fine. But Vaemond's death is strange. It doesn't seem like a natural illness. The manner of Vaemond's death was eerily familiar to Viserys. His father, Balon Targaryen, had died in a similar way after a hunting trip, his abdomen swelling painfully before his death. Alicent gasped. Could it be poison? Possibly, Viserys said, his voice heavy. There are many poisons in Lys. We can't rule it out. He sighed deeply. I heard that Lord Corlys has woken up. Vaemond's body will be returned to Driftmark for a funeral, and the royal family is expected to attend. Alicent nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I'll make the arrangements, she said, summoning a servant to notify Grand Maester Melos and send ravens with the news. At the same time, Rhaegar awoke from his sleep after spending the night soaking in a hot spring. His eyes were still clouded with confusion as he emerged from the water. Roar! Sensing his awakening, the cannibal, his dragon, rose from a nearby clearing and let out a low, rumbling growl. Rhaegar stretched, feeling the wrinkled texture of his soaked skin. "I'm all cut up," he muttered, scratching at his long, wet hair. He pulled on his robes, mounted the dragon, and flew back to Harrenhal. As soon as he landed, he saw the big, chubby True hurrying toward him. "What happened?" Rhaegar asked, unable to suppress a chuckle at True's comically fast pace. Panting heavily, True handed him a letter. "A message from Stepstones, Your Grace. I came to find you first." Rhaegar's demeanor changed instantly. He grabbed the letter and read it quickly. The letter was from Tormund, who had remained on Bloodstone Island. It detailed Vaemond's death and the circumstances surrounding it, suggesting that he had most likely been poisoned. Crushing the letter into a ball, Rhaegar thrust it back at True and said urgently, "Oversee the work at Harrenhal. Get Robb to help you. I'll go back to King's Landing." "Yes, Prince," True replied, catching the ball of paper and nodding vigorously. Without another word, Rhaegar mounted the cannibal and took off, flying back to King's Landing. Within the hour, the cannibal had flown from Harrenhal back to King's Landing. Harrenhal's strategic location was vital. It blocked the nobles from the Riverlands and used the fast-flowing rivers of the Three Forks to keep the armies of the Vale and the North at bay. Most importantly, it was in close proximity to King's Landing. Roar! The cannibal circled over King's Landing, roaring to announce its return. It landed in the Dragon Pit, and Rhaegar dismounted, intending to head straight to the Red Keep. "Prince, wait a moment." A black-robed figure emerged from a shadowed corner, moving with a light step. Rhaegar turned to see Syrio, his trusted agent, whose fluffy brown curls peeked out from under his hood. "Any rumors in King's Landing lately?" Rhaegar asked. Syrio managed a group of skilled operatives who specialized in gathering intelligence in King's Landing. "Indeed," Syrio replied with a smirk. "The high and mighty have been splattered with shit, thinking they can work with worms." Rhaegar frowned. "Worm?" "Otto found someone to collaborate with," Syrio explained. "White Worm, also known as Mysaria, a prostitute from Lys and Prince Daemon's former mistress. She organizes the largest intelligence network in King's Landing, though her allegiances remain unclear." Rhaegar's brow furrowed further. "Look into the White Worm. To stop Otto from working with her?" Syrio inquired. Rhaegar shook his head. "No need. It's time for the King's Landing reorganization plan to be put on the agenda. Let Otto handle that. As for the White Worm, no matter how much information she gathers, she can't stand against true power struggles." The Red Keep. Rhaegar walked into the Red Keep and ascended the stairs of Maegor's Holdfast. Around a corner, he encountered a slender, middle-aged man with a shaved head. "Prince, can I help you?" the man asked. "No, Lord Caswell," Rhaegar replied, sidestepping with a polite nod. Lord Caswell, from the Caswell House of Bitterbridge in the Riverlands, loyal to House Tyrell, nodded slightly and made way. Reaching the upper floors, Rhaegar headed to the king's chambers, where he found his father, Viserys, at breakfast. "Father, Lord Vaemond has been killed." Rhaegar used the word killed deliberately. Viserys, cutting into sizzling mutton, chewed thoughtfully before replying, "I know. We'll be going to Driftmark soon for the funeral." "I'm glad you know," Rhaegar said, noting his father's calm demeanor. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten. With a bitter smile, he moved a chair and joined his father at the dining table. Chapter 247, King's Landing's Plan of Reconstruction. The table was laden with beef stew, roast lamb, cream cake, and a bottle of red wine with the cork pulled. Rhaegar's appetite was immense. He grabbed a piece of beef and muttered, "Father, you eat so well this early in the morning." "I am a king, after all," Viserys said with a smile, taking a sip of wine. "With the burdens I carry, it is a small pleasure to indulge in good food." He patted his rounded belly, a testament to his indulgence. "You have a point," Rhaegar agreed, taking a large bite of food. Being king did have its perks, though he worried about his father's health with such a rich diet. As they ate, father and son chatted, enjoying their little gathering. Halfway through the meal, Rhaegar pulled out a list and handed it to his father, who had just finished his wine. "What's this?" Viserys leaned back in his chair and took the list. It's my plan for improving King's Landing, Rhaegar explained. Intrigued, Viserys read the list. 1. Eliminate rats, deodorize and seal complex secret passage entrances and exits in the Red Keep. 2. Repair and excavate King's Landing sewers to facilitate proper sewage disposal. 3. Expand areas, repair public toilets, and hire septic workers and septic carts. 4. Organize Flea Bottom, take in a group of orphans, women, and children, and organize laborers for construction work. 5. Select land in the Crownlands and organize the poor to cultivate it, providing royal subsidies and tax relief. Viserys frowned at the first 3 items, his expression complicated. Rhaegar, your plan is ambitious. Otto has been trying to clean up the streets of King's Landing, but his efforts have been ineffective and have drawn criticism from the common folk. And last night a wagon load of filth was thrown at him, Viserys added, grimacing at the memory. Rhaegar had anticipated his father's concern. The key is sewers and public toilets. If we provide convenient facilities, people won't have to dump their waste in the streets. The concept of public toilets was foreign to Viserys. Rhaegar continued, public toilets were an idea I saw in a dream. They fit our needs perfectly. Much of Otto's failure stemmed from banning open defecation without providing an alternative. Building public toilets and hiring waste collectors would solve the problem. Though it seemed simple, it was a revolutionary proposal. Viserys considered it carefully. With public toilets, people would have a proper place to dispose of their waste. Anyone caught defecating in the streets could then be properly punished. There's only one thing, Viserys thought. Viserys hesitated. Repairing the sewers, public toilets, and hiring workers will cost a considerable amount of money. King's Landing had sewers, but they had long been neglected and were mostly clogged. Repairing the public toilets required funds for materials and labor. Hiring septic tank emptiers and haulers would further drain the treasury. Rhaegar pointed to the remaining 2 suggestions, his tone thoughtful. We could hire laborers from Flea Bottom to do the work in exchange for food. People were dying of starvation and exposure every day in King's Landing. This food-for-work approach would save money and help the refugees, a win-win. Viserys pondered. His eyes fell on the last suggestion, and he instinctively bristled. Dividing the king's uncultivated land among the refugees. I don't mean give it away, Rhaegar clarified. We'd hire them to farm it. The crown would provide tools and food, and the refugees would become tenants directly under the crown, paying annual taxes. This proposal wasn't far from the typical lord and peasant relationship. The crownlands had plenty of wasteland and the kingswood held untapped resources. Instead of letting it sit idle, turning it into productive farmland could stabilize tax revenue and eventually fill the royal coffers. Most importantly, it would alleviate overcrowding in King's Landing. Viserys fell into deep thought, weighing the feasibility of the 5 plans. The war for the Stepstones had drained resources, and the construction of the prince's palace was another financial drain. Adding sewer repairs, the construction of public toilets, and land reclamation would further drain the treasury, even if it was currently full. Rhaegar didn't press the issue. He finished his meal and left the palace quietly. His father was the king, and it was his decision to implement the new policies or not. Rhaegar offered his ideas without insisting. The Iron Throne would be his eventually, and he could implement the new policies then. For now, his priority was to repair Harrenhal and build the Dragon's Nest. Dawn. Viserys emerged from his thoughts, feeling dazed and confused. He scanned the table, the servants had already cleared away the remains. At some point, Rhaegar had quietly left. Eric, Viserys called, rubbing his tingling legs as he stood. Creak. The door opened and Eric stood at attention. Your Grace, what is your command? Viserys folded the list and combed his hair with his fingers, speaking calmly. Go to the dungeon. I want to see that white-eyed wolf. Yes, Your Grace, Eric replied, his face impassive as he respectfully stepped aside to make way. Since Cole had been removed from his position as commander of the King's Guard, Eric and Eric had risen quickly through the ranks. One specialized in defending the king, the other the queen. It wouldn't be long before one of the brothers would be named the new commander of the King's Guard. Dungeon. The dimly lit environment reeked of stench, and the wails of prisoners echoed from the cages. Eric led the way with a torch in one hand, casting flickering shadows on the damp walls. Viserys followed behind, covering his nose and mouth with a handkerchief. He would not have set foot in this place if he hadn't needed to meet his uncooperative brother. They walked deeper into the dungeon and came to a familiar cell. Brother, what brings you back here? Daemon asked, sitting drowsily on the wooden bed, the shackles on his hands and feet clanking with every movement. It had been so long that he couldn't tell day from night and often lost track of time. Viserys looked at him in disgust and handed him a list of plans. Take a look at this and tell me if it's feasible. Humph, do you take me for a counselor in custody? Daemon snorted but still got up and took the list, examining it. Locked in the dungeon, he had realized that sometimes one has to bend to survive. The last time he had taunted Alicent, he found something foul in his food the next day. It had taken 3 days for the prison food to return to normal. Viserys, in high spirits, did not care to argue. He kept his brother in the dungeon to be used when needed. There was a certain satisfaction in having him at his disposal. Daemon rolled his eyes and scanned the list. Repairing the gutter, cleaning the sewers. He muttered, quickly losing interest. For him, these were trivial matters. After a long pause, Viserys asked, "What do you think?" "About what?" Daemon's head dropped and his voice grew longer. "The new plan." Viserys snapped. "Answer me honestly or you'll starve for another 3 days." Daemon stared at the list, surprised. "You know." "Humph, my own brother eating shit in the dungeon, do you think I don't know?" Viserys retorted sarcastically. "I don't care what Alicent said to you. Just don't mess with these crazy women." "Oh, you don't," Daemon sighed, shaking his head. "What do you know? Just answer the question." Viserys was losing patience. Daemon shook the list and adopted a more serious tone. "It's all right. The sewers in King's Landing do need cleaning, and building public toilets is a good idea." When he had been the commander of the city watch, he had both loved and loathed patrolling the streets. Apprehending criminals was thrilling, but the stench of King's Landing was unbearable. Every day, his boots stepped in a different kind of filth. Viserys nodded in satisfaction and continued, "What about the last 2 points, employing civilians and encouraging the opening of land? Who came up with this plan?" Daemon asked, sidestepping the question. "Rhaegar's suggestion," Viserys replied honestly. "Tisk, clever boy, full of possessiveness," Daemon smirked. He could see the implications of the plan, to clear out the excess population of the monarchy and eliminate the potential for civilian riots. Every generation of Targaryen kings had entertained this idea, but it was undoubtedly difficult to implement. After thinking for a moment, Daemon banged the back of his head against the iron railing and murmured, "The plan is feasible and seamless." With a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Who will execute the plan?" "Otto Hightower," Viserys said bluntly. "Oh, good choice," Daemon sneered, baring his teeth and shrugging slightly. "This kind of drudgery where you'll be cursed for even suggesting it is perfect for Otto, that old bastard." "Daemon, watch your language," Viserys warned, glaring at him. Like it or not, Otto was still his father-in-law. "Che, you asked." "I'm going back to sleep," Daemon retorted, throwing away the list and lying down on the wooden bed. Viserys, seething with frustration, said through gritted teeth, "Daemon, don't you want to get out of here?" "And how can I do that, as a sinner?" Daemon asked rhetorically, pulling the covers over his head. "Humph, think about it," Viserys grunted coldly, leaving the words, "Vaemond is dead." With that, he walked out of the dungeon under Eric's escort. As the sound of footsteps gradually faded, the wooden bed in the cell creaked. Daemon lifted the covers, his eyes gradually regaining their brightness. Vaemond's death had introduced too many variables. It could be a prelude to war or the beginning of House Valyrian's decline. All he needed was the right opportunity to escape the cold, damp dungeon. With that in mind, Daemon closed his eyes and muttered, "Brother, you and I are really connected by blood." Chapter 248, Sea Snake's Hatred. 7 days passed in a blur. The 3-masted ship, bearing the 3 red dragon flags, crossed Blackwater Bay and arrived at the harbour of Driftmark. The harbour was not as bustling as usual, it felt eerily quiet. Apart from a few freighters, the only sound was the rustling of the tides washing the beach. Rhaena, dressed in a white gown, waited at the harbour, her eyes fixed on the approaching royal ship. A group of guards stepped onto the dock, forming 2 lines. Alicent, in a green dress, was the first to appear, supporting a pale and weak Viserys. "Slow down, we're on land now," Alicent gently urged, patting her husband on the back. Viserys' seasickness had returned with a vengeance, and he had been vomiting profusely. The king and queen led the way, with Rhaegar and his younger siblings following behind. To accommodate his father, Rhaegar had opted for the slower boat ride instead of flying on his dragon. Roar! The shadow of a dragon flashed across the sky, disturbing the other dragons and breaking the peaceful atmosphere. Golden Syrox, Sunfire, and the light silver-grey sea smoke scattered at the sight of Cannibal's arrival. Laena stepped forward to greet them, bowing respectfully. "Your Grace." Viserys nodded, attempting to speak, but swallowed back his words as his throat tightened. "He's a bit under the weather. We'll need the maester to take a look at him later," Alicent said, forcing a smile and conveying her husband's condition. Laena nodded in understanding and led the way ahead. As they rode into high tide in the carriage, the atmosphere inside the castle was even more somber. When they entered the hall, many guests were already waiting. Laena apologized, "Father is bedridden and mother is attending to the guests. I'm the only one available to entertain you." The sea snake had been seriously injured in the defeat at Bloodstone Island and had been recuperating on Driftmark. He had just awakened but suffered a high fever upon hearing of Vaemond's death and was in a fragile state. Viserys, his seasickness eased somewhat, managed a weak smile. "It's no problem. Take me to Lord Corley's. He needed to meet the master of the castle, of course." "This way, Your Grace," Laena replied, and with Alicent's help, they assisted the king up the stairs. Left aside, Rhaegar shrugged and addressed his younger siblings, "Move around freely, but don't wander off." "Okay," Helena replied first, taking Aemond and Durin by the hands and heading towards the table laden with food. Durin, like a curious child, quickly freed himself from his sister's grip and scampered off. Aemond, blushing slightly, allowed his sister to lead the way, following like a shadow. Rhaegar didn't worry much. The different hair and eye colors of his siblings made them easily recognizable. In the relatively safe confines of Driftmark, there was no one who would dare bully them. "Rhaegar." He turned at the sound of Rhaenyra's voice and saw her on the stairs leading to the second floor. Rhaenyra had abandoned her usual luxurious style. She was wearing a simple, long, strapless black dress, devoid of her usual elaborate lace and jewelry. Her long hair was pulled back. With a single glance, Rhaegar understood the reason for her attire. "Rhaenyra, have you become a nanny?" he teased, noticing the swaddled babies she was holding. Rhaenyra proudly lifted her chin and denied, "No. I have no milk. I am the adoptive mother of 2 babies." After the celebration following the Riverlands rebellion, the siblings had parted ways for a while. Rhaenyra had flown to Driftmark to help with the children, keeping her promise to Laena. Rhaegar climbed the steps and reached out to take one of the swaddled infants. "Humph, you know what you're doing," Rhaenyra said with a smile, clearly relieved to share the burden. Rhaegar glanced down at the swaddled, dark-skinned baby girl, who squirmed and waved her tiny arms and legs. After a moment, he lost interest and leaned closer to Rhaenyra, whispering, "How is Lord Corley's?" "Don't be mean," Rhaenyra replied, nudging him. "Lord Corley's is fine, but Laenor cried so much I couldn't handle it." Laenor had gone to war with his uncle, survived the battle, but his uncle died from the aftermath. Realizing something was wrong had deeply shocked him. As Rhaenyra spoke, Rhaegar's eyes flickered with thought. Logically, if the Triarchy was targeting someone for assassination, it wouldn't have been Vaemond. Aegon and Laenor were more obvious choices. Yet, Vaemond was the one struck down. He couldn't make sense of it. Rhaenyra nudged him again and said quietly, "Don't dwell on it. The funeral is this afternoon." "Okay," Rhaegar replied, his thoughts coming back to the present. "Find a nurse to feed the baby." He walked up the stairs with a teasing smile. Afternoon. The sea breeze blew gently, and the tide washed over the reef. In the back garden of high tide, on a flat, sea-facing cliff, guests gathered around a solid wood coffin carved with a human figure in the center. Viserys and Alicent stood to the side with their children. Corlys, seated in a wheelchair with gauze around his neck, was pushed by Rhaenys, who was covered in a black veil. When the hour arrived, Corlys ignored the advice of Rhaenys and chose to bury his brother himself. In a dull, hoarse voice, he recited a eulogy. "We meet this day at the seat of the sea to send Sir Vaemond of the House of Velaryon into the waters of eternity, within the borders of the King of Mermaids. Forever under his protection in the years to come." As the eulogy was recited line by line, the guards attached ropes to the coffin and slowly lowered it into the waters below the cliff. With the most important part of the funeral now over, the guests dispersed, and the servants brought out food and wine for the farewell feast. Roar! A dragon's roar rang out as Syrinx flapped its wings, hovering over the castle as if spreading its wings in farewell. Accompanying Syrinx were Malaise, the Red Queen, and Sea Smoke. On the mountaintop adjacent to the castle, a light blue dragon lounged lazily, flicking its tail. On the crags of the neighboring cliffs, Sunfire stood on 2 feet, looking down proudly. Cannibal and Rhaegar were absent, their immense size left no suitable place for them to land. Viserys took Alicent's hand and headed back to the castle with Corlys and Rhaenys. Laena found Rhaenyra and pulled her aside for a chat. Rhaegar was left behind again, looking around helplessly. Laenor, looking mournful, drank wine after wine, accompanied by a handsome knight. Aegon drank his wine with equal fervour, his eyes lingering on the maids, occasionally slapping one on the backside. With nothing else to do, Rhaegar stretched and found Helaena sitting on her knees in a corner, playing with a ball of thread. She closed her eyes, feigning sleep. "Sister!" Aemond ran from the distance with a smile on his face. Helaena immediately turned her head and put her index finger to her lips, reminding him, "Shhh. Keep your voice down." She pointed to Rhaegar, who was sitting behind her, signaling Aemond to be quiet. Aemond froze, his hands stirring behind his back, and whispered, "Oh, okay." Stealing a glance at his older brother, Rhaegar, there was more than a touch of jealousy in his eyes. Beside the wine table, Laena held Rhaenyra's hand and smiled warmly. "Rhaenyra, thank you for preparing the dragon eggs for the children." "It's my responsibility as their foster mother," Rhaenyra replied calmly. "Thank you," Laena repeated, her eyes flashing with reluctance. She took a deep breath. "When the children turn 1, they will be sent to Dragonstone or King's Landing, where you will raise them." Adopting a child in these times was akin to taking a hostage, an agreement both parties had already accepted, yet it pained Laena to part with her children. Rhaenyra, not yet a mother herself, couldn't fully grasp her friend's anguish but offered reassurance. "The children will grow up healthy in my care. Whether they become dragon riders or ladies, they will have the choice." "I believe you," Laena responded with a bittersweet smile. Then she hesitated before asking, "What about Daemon? I haven't heard from him since leaving King's Landing." Rhaenyra paused, then replied, "He's managing. I don't know the details, but he's probably in the dungeon doing penance." Both women exchanged a knowing smile at the word penance. With Daemon's prideful nature, admitting fault or repenting was unlikely. Laena squeezed Rhaenyra's hand slightly harder and pleaded, "Rhaenyra, on the children's first naming day, I want them to meet their father." "You'll need to ask my father for that," Rhaenyra replied, narrowing her eyes. Laena's sincerity was evident as she whispered, "I will seek his grace's favour, but I need your help, for the sake of the children." "I'll try. It's just one meeting, it shouldn't be a problem," Rhaenyra said, drawing back her hand, her voice cold. "Thank you," Laena whispered gratefully. High tide, Driftwood Throne Hall. Corlys sat in a wheelchair, his face etched with dismay. Beside him, Rhaenys looked on, her worry for her husband's health evident. "Lord Corlys, I am deeply saddened by Sir Viamond's passing. The kingdom will remember his dedication," Viserys said from the Driftwood throne, his gaze steady on Corlys and Rhaenys. Rhaenys stepped forward, her voice firm. "Cousin, you and I both know that Viamond's death is not natural." She had already begun an investigation and suspected the use of a notorious poison, tears of Lys. Colorless and tasteless, it could be easily slipped into food, causing mild stomach discomfort at first, but worsening until it became lethal. Viserys' smile faded. "The Triarchy suffered heavy losses. I expected retaliation, but not like this." Rhaenys was about to speak when Corlys interrupted. "Your Grace, Viamond died for the realm. His life's honor is intact. But the Triarchy is growing too bold, and the defences of the Stepstones remain inadequate." Viserys asked, "The mercenaries on Grey Gallows are retreating, and the army of the realm is stationed there. What more is needed?" Corlys, his voice raspy but determined, replied, "To end this threat, we must build fortresses on Bloodstone Island and Grey Gallows Island. Constant vigilance is needed against the Triarchy's attacks." This was a proposal Corlys had championed since becoming the Navy commander. "I will consider it carefully, Lord Corlys," Viserys said after a moment of silence. His mind wandered to Alicent's idea of giving the land for Aegon and to Daemon languishing in the dungeon. With that, the conversation ended and Viserys left high tide. Corlys watched him retreat, his eyes dark and uncertain, his fists clenched. The Velaryon house had sacrificed too much in the Stepstones War. Corlys, Take it easy, Rhaenys urged, her concern palpable. I'm fine, Corlys replied, though his gaze remained fixed on the flickering candle flame. He murmured to himself, the Triarchy will pay a more painful price, sooner or later. Chapter 249, Rhaegar's Changes. Time passed like a fleeting shadow. The year was 121 AC. On a bright spring morning, a golden dragon soared above the tranquil waters of the God's Eye Lake, its scales glistening in the sunlight. Roar! The dragon's roar echoed through the air as it gracefully maneuvered through the clouds, adjusting its wings to change direction. In the center of God's Eye Lake lay the lush Isle of Faces, its appearance drastically transformed over the past 3 years. On the island's northern side, a massive, dark structure dominated the landscape. Towering at 500 feet, it was neither fully a mountain nor entirely a tower, with 4 large openings that allowed the wind to howl through, creating a sound akin to a horn. The golden dragon circled the formidable building before gliding towards the lake's northern shore. Its belly schemed the shimmering surface, and its slender tail created ripples as it brushed through the water. Harenil stood proudly nearby, its thick, steep walls newly repaired. Soldiers clad in black armor patrolled with disciplined precision. A sudden gust of wind sent the soldiers reeling. Alert! They looked up to see the golden dragon flying over the city wall and into the castle grounds. At ease. It's the princess and her dragon. The captain of the soldiers recognized the dragon and its rider and paid his respects before resuming his patrol. In front of the King's Pyre Tower, where the bear pit once stood, young shoots pushed through the soil, and a dusting of snow adorned the lone willow tree. On one wall of the tower, a spacious hut had been constructed, furnished with simple tables and stools. Inside, dozens of teenagers sat attentively, listening to a tall and stout teacher's lesson. Clang, clang. The sound of a zither echoed, a seemingly joyful tune tinged with melancholy. The source of the music was a stone pavilion nestled in the tower's corner. Inside, the melody was played by a young man with silver blonde hair cascading down his back. He sat on a red carpet, a harp in his lap, his fingers gently stroking the strings. The young man's pale skin and strikingly handsome features were marred only by the dark circles under his deep purple eyes, giving him a slightly gloomy appearance. Black thread, dragon, rose. Intermittent murmurs of a girl accompanied the zither's music. Lying behind the young man was a girl with similarly silver blonde, slightly curly hair. She propped herself up on her hands, her legs swaying gently. Who? A massive golden dragon swooped over the castle courtyard, landing outside the pavilion. On its back, Rhaenyra, dressed in a long red gown with her hair pulled back, unfastened the chain around her waist and climbed down the soft ladder with nimble grace. Jumping to the ground, Rhaenyra patted the dragon's golden scales and smiled, "Go play, Syrax." Roar! Syrax roared softly, nuzzling its rider before flapping its wings and taking off. Above Harenil, 2 dragons, one black and one blue, circled slowly, chasing each other. Syrax joined them, adding to their frolic. "Rhaegar, you won't even come to welcome me." Rhaenyra entered the pavilion, hands behind her back. She was as beautiful as ever, untouched by the passage of time. Clang! The zither's melody stopped abruptly as delicate fingers calmed the trembling strings, soothing the unfinished melody. The young man lifted his head, his eyes gleaming with mischief as he looked at Rhaenyra. "You and I have a relationship that needs no formalities, sister," he said, deliberately emphasizing the last word. Rhaenyra blushed and retorted, "You don't even know how to make a proper gesture." Half a year ago, Rhaegar had chosen to follow family tradition, solidifying an agreement in the presence of their father, Viserys. While they typically addressed each other by name, in private, they acknowledged their familial bond. For Rhaegar to use the term now suggested he was up to something. "Rhaenyra, you just left the day before yesterday. Why are you back so soon?" Rhaegar asked, a puzzled smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Rhaenyra, now a foster mother to 2 girls and burdened with the affairs of King's Landing and Dragonstone, was always busy. Even if she came to Harenil to see him, it was never this frequent. "Why else?" "I have a mission, of course," Rhaenyra replied, exasperation in her voice. "Rhaegar, you haven't been back to King's Landing in over 6 months. Father misses you very much." Rhaegar's smile faded as he lowered his head, idly stroking the strings of his zither, his interest in conversation waning. 3 years ago, after Vaemond Valerian's funeral, Rhaegar had returned to the capital, where Viserys frequently sought his company. They hadn't discussed monarchy reforms or the state of Harenil and the Dragon's Nest. Instead, they clashed over two proposals regarding the stepstones, with Rhaegar firmly opposed to his father's plans. Their disagreements escalated into a heated argument, resulting in a rift between them. Rhaegar had left King's Landing for Harrenhal, dedicating himself to restoring the castle and constructing the anew dragon's nest. Rhaegar, you've been away from King's Landing too long. The realm needs a visible savior, Rhaenyra said, sitting beside him in the pavilion and gently trying to persuade him. In the 3 years since, Rhaegar had barely returned to the capital, and rumors of a rift between the king and his heir were circulating among the court's advisors. Rhaenyra, are you afraid someone will seize power in my absence? Rhaegar asked, his expression unreadable. Though frustrated by his father's poor decisions, Rhaegar was not reckless. Despite his physical distance from King's Landing, his influence grew daily. From Harrenhal, he kept a watchful eye on Old Tully at Riverrun, using Tully as an intermediary to strengthen his ties with the lords of the Riverlands. House Blackwood was the first to pledge allegiance, followed by other Riverland nobles. In the Vale, his long association with Jane, House Royce and House Grafton of Gulltown secured their unwavering support. Through the ever-expanding mushroom-set caravan, he maintained strong personal relationships with the nobles of the Crownlands and the Riverlands. Rhaegar might not be visible in King's Landing, but his presence was felt throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Rhaenyra looked deeply into Rhaegar's eyes and sighed. In a few days it will be your naming day. Father is organizing a family feast and asked me to tell you that you must attend. You know I've never liked naming days since I was a child, Rhaegar muttered. Rhaenyra moved closer, her voice softer. Please go back. Father's been dreaming about you lately. Even Alicent has noticed. Clang. Rhaegar strummed the strings of his zither, producing an abrupt, discordant sound. He had no desire to attend a family feast. Away from King's Landing and its political turmoil, he relished the freedom of his own domain. After rebuilding Harrenhal Castle and adding a dragon's nest to the Isle of Faces, life was more than comfortable. Rhaegar. Rhaenyra's face grew solemn, her initial softness giving way to firmness. What's wrong? Helena, startled by the sound, looked up blankly, her beautiful face framed by silver blonde hair. Rhaenyra turned towards her. At 12, Helena had already experienced her first period, though she still had the appearance of an innocent, wide-eyed girl. Her long, curly hair was tied into a bun, and she wore a goose-down dress that highlighted her slender figure, inherited from Alicent. She sat on the red carpet, surrounded by carved stone toys and woolen balls, clutching a green thread and a dragon stone carving. Rhaenyra sighed, shaking her head in resignation. Nothing, Helena. Carry on. Oh, okay. Helena nodded obediently, then looked up again, confusion evident in her eyes. Sister, didn't you leave the day before yesterday? I'm back, Rhaenyra replied, doubly annoyed. Since Rhaegar's ascension, Helena's behavior had become increasingly strange. Not only was she a prophet, but she also displayed a strange sense of disorientation. Helena simply said oh and lowered her head to play with the stone carving, minimizing her presence. She had been staying in Harrenhal for a few months, escaping the damp and cold winter climate of King's Landing. Here, she enjoyed the warmth and lack of restrictions. Splat! As they spoke, the dragonstone carving in Helena's hand slipped and struck a red rose. The rose toppled, its petals wilting and losing their luster. Helena, visibly upset, stared at the fallen carving, frustration etched on her face. With Helena momentarily silent, Rhaenyra resumed her plea. Rhaegar, this is your 16th name day. You must return to King's Landing with me. Her tone was firm, brooking no argument. In Westeros, a boy came of age at 16. Rhaegar, having reached that milestone, had to participate in the ceremony his father had arranged, whether he wanted to or not. Rhaegar looked at her, his eyes flickering with indecision. Noticing his hesitation, Rhaenyra's eyes grew stern. She reached for the soft flesh at his waist, ready to assert her authority. Fine, fine, I'll go back with you, Rhaegar conceded, quickly intercepting her hand, a rueful smile on his lips. Rhaenyra frowned, looking for confirmation. Really? Of course. A Targaryen keeps his word, Rhaegar assured her, a hint of certainty returning to his voice. Indeed, he had been away from King's Landing too long. Many responsibilities had been delayed, including his knighthood, which should have been conferred at 13. That's more like it, Rhaenyra murmured, her tone softening. She took the harp from his hands and set it on a nearby stand. Rhaegar stretched, intending to stand and move. "Sit down, you're not leaving just yet," Rhaenyra instructed, pulling him back into her arms and leaning close. 3 years had passed quickly, and Rhaegar had grown. His once youthful face had matured, his height had increased, and his body had developed solid muscles. He had become the kind of man whose slender appearance concealed a muscular frame. His handsome face was captivating, his deep eyes intense. Troubled by nightmares, he had taken up the harp under the guidance of a renowned teacher to calm his mind and soothe his nerves. "What are your plans after the name day?" Rhaenyra's voice was soft, her chin resting on his shoulder, her red lips close to his ear. The date was set. Rhaegar was an adult now, and momentous events loomed on the horizon. "Father will probably arrange for us to tour the continent and visit various nobles," Rhaegar mused, inhaling the scent of her hair. "Once I'm officially knighted, everything will fall into place." Chapter 250, Rhaegar's Influence. Night. King's Pyre Tower, Hall of 100 Hearths. The hall was cavernous and grand, with 34 hearths and a smooth stone floor. At a long table of solid wood, Rhaenyra, Helaena, and Rhaegar dined. Nibbling on unseasonal fruits, Rhaenyra glanced around and muttered, "Every time I come here, it feels so exaggerated." She kept her voice low, afraid the vastness of the hall would amplify it into an echo. Harrenhal, a massive castle, had taken Blackfire over 40 years to build. The scale of its great hall alone was almost beyond comprehension. Records claimed that the Hall of 100 Hearths was large enough to house an army. Harrenhal stands out for its size and sturdiness. "You'll get used to it," Rhaegar said, smiling proudly. The castle's restoration had advanced rapidly with the use of black dragon stone. Aside from essential buildings such as courtyards, bathhouses, and stables, the 5 towers were of paramount importance. After Balrion's burning, the towers had been twisted and deformed, their roofs scorched. Yet their walls remained thick, almost indestructible. The interiors were mostly intact, requiring only minor repairs. Rhaegar had the distorted exteriors stripped away and replaced with black dragon stone, creating new outer walls. The tops of the towers were restored to their original heights and levels, and decorated with stone dragon carvings in the style of the Sea Dragon Tower on Dragonstone Island. The King's Pyre Tower featured carvings of cannibal, while the Widow's Tower, connected to it, was adorned with the likeness of Grey Ghost, a dragon that had moved from Dragonstone Island to Isle of Faces. The Wailing Tower, with its storeroom and vast cellar, bore the symbol of Syrax, representing fertility. The Tower of Dread, linked to a rebuilt September, had its spire carved with Dreamfire, Helena's dragon. The Tower of Ghosts still had no dragon sculpture, as Aegon's Sunfire was used to the last current generation of dragon masters of House Targaryen. With the completion of these towers, Harrenhal's style was transformed forever. Once dark and devastated, it had become the grandest castle in Westeros. To placate the faith, Rhaegar rebuilt the September, cut down the burned weirwood trees, and replaced them with ornamental trees, a project that took a year and a half. Consequently, some sections of Harrenhal's walls remained unfinished, still being repaired with black dragon stone. Seeing Rhaegar's pride, Rhaenyra smiled genuinely and offered heartfelt praise. One major reason Rhaegar had not returned to King's Landing was the demanding construction schedule at Harrenhal, leaving him no time to spare. "I'm full," Helaena said, putting down her knife and fork. Her cheeks were bulging and she took a sip of fruit wine to help with her full stomach. Rhaegar chuckled softly. "Go to bed now, Helaena. We'll go back to King's Landing tomorrow." Good night, brother." Helaena hopped out of her chair and walked around the table to give Rhaegar a hug. Then, glancing at Rhaenyra, who was sipping red wine, she approached briskly and reached out for another hug. "Good night, sister." With that, Helaena wiped her mouth and made her way up the stairs from the Great Hall. The Hall of 100 Hearths was huge, with 2 corridors and countless rooms branching off the stairs. Once Helaena was gone, Rhaenyra turned back to Rhaegar. "Rhaegar, you and Jane." "She's fine. I saw her 3 months ago," Rhaegar replied, his demeanor relaxed, the awkwardness of the previous days gone. "She understands my decision. I'll explain everything to her when I get the chance." "Good. It's important that you keep that in mind," Rhaenyra nodded, asking no further questions. Jane had been remarkably understanding, staying peacefully in the Vale and communicating only through ravens. Even though Rhaenyra couldn't fully accept what had happened, she admired Jane's tolerance. When dinner was nearly finished, Rhaegar pulled out 2 letters. "Tyland wrote to me a few days ago about a severe drought in Dorne. Bands of mobs have started roaming the borders. Rhaenyra took the papers, her expression growing serious. It's not just Dorne that's having problems. The Tyrell house in Highgarden is also in trouble. She continued, Lord Tyrell is very old and has only one son, who has been weak and sickly since childhood. Recently, the heir contracted a cold and died in the citadel. With no other sons, Lord Tyrell sent a letter to you, implicitly seeking permission to legitimize a bastard. Rhaenyra's face grew stern. Rhaegar, you must never agree to this. Your status cannot support such approval. Don't worry, I haven't written back, Rhaegar reassured her, taking a calm sip of his fruit wine. In Westeros, where bloodlines were paramount, bastards were greatly disfavored. As the king's eldest son and heir to the kingdom, Rhaegar was among those least able to support the legitimacy of bastards. Supporting a bastard for the Highgarden succession could set a dangerous precedent, potentially undermining his own position and that of his family. Relieved, Rhaenyra sighed. The Tully and Tyrell families both face similar problems with their heirs. Old Tully's eldest son had died in battle, leaving Riverrun without a clear heir. For the past 3 years, he had wavered between his 2 younger sons and his grandson. While the second son should theoretically be first in line, both were too weak and foolish. The grandson, though mediocre, was at least capable. Old Tully wanted to make his grandson heir, but his 2 younger sons had banded together to cause trouble and disturb the peace of Riverrun. Rhaegar, unwilling to interfere, left the Tullys to resolve their problems independently. Seeing Rhaenyra's frustration, Rhaegar smiled helplessly. But these 2 families are among the most loyal to the crown. We can't just ignore them. Let's not talk about them anymore. It's frustrating, Rhaenyra said in exasperation. It's late. Let's get some sleep, Rhaegar suggested. Very well. Serve your queen and take me to bed, Rhaenyra replied playfully, opening her arms. Rhaegar laughed and rose to carry her. The next morning, Harrenhal Castle buzzed with activity as craftsmen worked on repairing the walls. Most of these workers had come from King's Landing, deployed by Maester Maynard of the Dragon Pit. The rest were slaves and natives of the Riverlands. Rhaegar estimated that about 1,000 craftsmen and their families, a total of 4,000 to 5,000 people, now lived within the castle. Fortunately, the vast expanse of Harrenhal easily accommodated them all. Suddenly, the air was filled with the thunderous roar of dragons, accompanied by fierce winds that swept over the castle walls. The craftsmen steadied themselves and looked up in awe. In the clear sky, a massive black dragon, as dark as charcoal, led the way, its wings casting a wide shadow over the land. Dreamfire, slightly smaller, flew alongside, carrying Helena, whose eyes sparkled with excitement as she soared through the clouds. The smallest of the trio, Syrax, followed, 3 times smaller than Cannibal and not yet an adult. The 3 dragons circled the vast expanse of God's Eye Lake before heading southeast in a less traveled direction. A few dozen miles from Harrenhal, they approached a large, unwalled village. From the sky, the village was a sprawling beehive of human activity. The houses were strange, with round stone walls and conical roofs of wooden beams that resembled large mushrooms with brown caps and grey stalks. This was Mushroom Village, a bustling market community. The village was a mix of free folk loyal to Rhaegar, slaves, and women and children taken in from Flea Bottom. It thrived on trading regional specialties, leather goods, and handicrafts. Rhaegar had even acquired several fruit groves, and the slaves produced a popular, refreshing sweet fruit wine that sold well at the market. Mushroom Village had become a major trading hub, attracting merchants from the Riverlands, the Crownlands, and even as far as the Vale, the Reach, and the Stormlands. Each year, the wealth generated by the market grew exponentially. As the dragons flew overhead, the cannibal's eyes gleamed with superiority. With a powerful flap of its wings, it soared over the bustling village below, indifferent to the small gathering of people that seemed like mere bugs from its vantage point. The sun rose, casting its warm light over the land and melting away the winter chill. As a coastal city, King's Landing rarely saw snow, but the cold and damp climate was still harsh. Every winter, the alleys of Flea Bottom were littered with the bodies of those who had succumbed to the cold and hunger. This winter, however, had been different. The king had heeded Prince Rhaegar's advice and given the homeless refugees land in the kingdom to farm. Prince Rhaegar himself had welcomed many women and children into the Riverlands, providing them with work and a means to survive. As a result, the people of King's Landing fared better than in previous winters. As the morning wore on, the temperature slowly rose. Roar! A muffled dragon roar echoed through King's Landing. The black dragon, cannibal, circled above, its mouth spewing a trail of green dragon fire. People emerged from their homes, leaning against the walls to bask in the sun. When they heard the dragon's roar, they looked up in awe. The black dragon belongs to Prince Rhaegar. Prince Rhaegar has returned. The sight of cannibal brought the image of the young prince to their minds and filled them with hope. In recent years, Prince Rhaegar and his dragon had rarely been seen in King's Landing, often staying in the Riverlands. Each appearance of the black dragon stirred the hearts of the people, who admired a prince who cared for the commoners. Roar! Cannibal completed 2 full circles over King's Landing, heralding the return of both dragon and rider. Following closely, Dreamfire and Syrinx descended towards the dragon pit. At the gates of the dragon pit, the wiry Maester Maynard awaited, his face lit with excitement. As Cannibal landed, Rhaegar dismounted and greeted him. "Prince, it's been a long time," Maynard said, joyfully limping forward. "Long time no see, Maynard," Rhaegar replied with a smile. "This time, I'll be staying in King's Landing for a while." "Excellent," Maynard said, clapping his hands with glee. Roar! A sharp dragon roar emanated from within the dragon pit. Rhaegar turned, peering into the dim interior where a scarlet hue flickered. "Can it fly?" Rhaegar asked, frowning slightly. Maynard shook his head regretfully. "It's quite a struggle. The improperly healed wounds keep tearing and reconnecting. It'll take at least 1.5 years before it can return to the sky." Rhaegar nodded, handing Cannibal over to the dragon keepers. Even in his absence, the dragon pit remained under his control, ensuring the safety and care of his dragons.
Thanks for listening.